they were all in agreement about what we could do for Charlie, what the treatment options were. There was drugs, and there was brain surgery, and you're out of luck. And so it was a while ago, but so Charlie was born March 11th, 1992, and he had a pretty normal first year. And then right around his first birthday, a little before his first birthday, I was actually pushing him in a swing one day, and he kind of threw his arm up in the air and twitched his head a little bit, and I didn't even think much of it. And I asked my wife, Nancy, I said, have you seen anything like that? And she said, yeah, I've seen a bunch of it. So that was the beginning, and we started seeing neurologists. The seizures increased in intensity and in duration. He wound up having seizures in the arms of the chief of pediatric neurology at Boston Children's Hospital, Seattle Children's Hospital, UCLA, LA Children's Hospital. So we tried all the drugs that were available at the time. Charlie had a brain surgery, a horrendous brain surgery, and nothing really stopped his seizures. And we lost hope. We were basically told there is no hope. And one day after the visit, I stopped at the medical library, and as soon as I started researching pediatric epilepsy, one of the first things that came up was a ketogenic diet. And it was kind of shocking to me, because what it said was that about a third of the kids with epilepsy as bad as Charlie who go on a ketogenic diet have their seizures go away. And another third are significantly improved, and for a third it doesn't work. And yet, all of these folks we had taken Charlie to see never mentioned a word about diet.
Nutrition information can be so confusing, and as advanced as we are medically and scientifically, the question remains, what food should we eat to achieve good health?
We're in a war for information, and the fallout affects all of us. The media is just going to sell what people are going to buy. And if people knew the truth, they would know what to ask for. My name is Vinnie Tortorich, and I've been in the health and fitness game for the better part of 40 years, specializing in weight loss. Over the years, I've seen everything come and go at least 100 times. But as a country, we've only gotten fatter. What should I eat? What pill should I take? Should I take a pill? What about this protein shake? We all know someone who's trying to lose weight, and most of those people don't realize simply losing weight doesn't mean good health. My mother, for instance, she was always on some diet. One week it was the Cambridge diet, the next week it was the Scarsdale diet, the next week it was the cabbage soup diet. But wait a minute, the next week she ate nothing but bananas. Where did that come from? I always wonder about things like 8 8-ounce glasses of water per day. Really? Where did that come from? High blood pressure. You know, a doctor will say, oh, you have high blood pressure, stop drinking coffee. Really? These are all just myths.
The myths have become ingrained in our society far too strongly for people to realize they're myths.
What are some of the health myths we hear every day?
Grains are good for you and fat is bad for you.
Obesity is an energy balance disorder.
Calorie in, calorie out.
Calories in, calories out. As long as you're burning enough calories, you can ingest whatever you want.
That you have to exercise to have better health. Saturated fat is the cause of heart disease.
A low-fat diet is a healthy diet.
We saw fat in the coronary arteries, and that must come from ingested fat.
A growing number of doctors are learning that almost everything we're taught about nutrition is wrong.
And I realized there was this incredible story that we had gotten it pretty much completely upside down and backward on fat.
Believe it or not, the story of how we got to where we are today started in the 1860s with the Seventh-day Adventist Church and a woman named Ellen White. Ellen was a higher up in the church, and she would have these premonitions. And one night she had a dream that God came to her and said that we shouldn't eat anything with a face.
I was taken to another place high above this world, and I
There started modern-day veganism. It really didn't exist before then. There were other religious groups who were more vegetarian. They would eat eggs and dairy and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, God also told her that coffee and tea were bad, which made no sense because both of those are vegetation. Not long after in our history, there was a man named Wilhelm Stephenson. He also believed to a certain extent that a vegetable-heavy diet was mandatory for good health. He was an explorer who ended up living with Inuits in Canada in 1906. And in that time and place, he was forced to adopt a new diet due to the lack of options. He made a discovery that will change the way you look at food.
Well, this raises the whole question of food, then. You yourself must have longed for a green vegetable once in a while.
Well, I did at first.
At first, his preconceived notion is, I'm going to die. There is nothing green here. There is no vegetation. They simply eat fish and drink water.
It was unlike anything that he'd experienced, right? Completely unlike the Western diet. It was probably 70 to 80% fat. The Inuit lived half the year on caribou and half the year on whatever they could fish out of the sea.
For 4.5 months, I lived on literally nothing but fish and water. And at the end of 4.5 months, I was healthier than I'd never been before.
And this is on an exclusive meat diet?
That was exclusive fish in this case.
On this diet, they were perfectly healthy. I mean, Stephenson was somebody from the medical world, and he knew what cancer looked like, he knew what heart disease looked like, and he did not see anyone suffering from ill health in that community. When he came back to the United States, no one believed him, of course. What? People eating nothing but meat and fat? How could that be? They certainly would die.
Dr. Charles Norris, chief medical examiner, does not approve of an all-meat diet. I fail to see why the case of the Eskimo with his strict carnivorous diet should be cited as an example to the white American. The Eskimo has never accomplished anything, and the white man has.
We have a weakness of not learning from the natives, but rather teaching them. You see everything through the colored spectacles of your education you're bringing up.
You know, we go through this whole idea of green good, red bad. Greenpeace. A light turns green, it means go. Eat your greens. Yet, when you look at red, well, red means stop. Blood is red. It doesn't take long for media to pick up on these things, and we don't realize it's happening, but it's happening right in front of us.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
Back to Ellen White and her visions. Ellen was having these premonitions, and all of this was happening. The writings were happening in the mid-1860s. But 10 years earlier, in 1856, a 12-year-old boy came to work with the church. His family was in a church, and that was John Kellogg. John, by the time he was 16, was writing and putting out literature for the church. He would go on to share some of the most bizarre beliefs that Ellen White and the church had, including the idea that masturbation and sex were off-limits.
Excuse me, Ricky.
To stave off these sins of the flesh, you should never eat meat because meat increases sexual desire. Well, this is what eventually led to cornflakes. That's right, cornflakes were created by Seventh-day Adventists to curb sexual desires. He was the guy who figured out something that he termed dextrinization. It's when you cook down grain so much it turns into dextrose, it turns into a sugar. You know, today when you see dextrose in a product, you should run in the opposite direction. It's as bad as seeing high fructose corn syrup. It's used for bacon, it's used in salami. All the luncheon meats that you get includes dextrose nowadays because it gives it a shelf life. It's a way to cure it fast, it's cheap, it's easy to do. So something that John Kellogg started way back in the day has also seeped across to the other side and to the meat industry.
There are two issues. There's always multiple questions. One is if you switch from a standard American diet of processed foods and sugary beverages and, for lack of a better word, we'll call it junk, and switch to a vegan diet with healthy vegetables and beans and legumes and fruits, you're getting rid of a lot of crap that's probably bad for you, which is the sugar and the highly refined processed foods. You would expect somebody to feel better if they did that. The second question is, if you did that and switched to a whole food diet that was animal food based rather than plant based, would they be healthier?
I have spent aggregated more than 6 years on red meat. That is seal meat, caribou meat, muskox meat, polar bear, grizzly bear, and so on.
The Stephenson diet was considered an all-meat diet. So what he did in 1928 was subjecting himself and a friend of his to living in a hospital, being monitored for an entire year, eating nothing but meat, fish, and water, and that became the famous Bellevue study.
The studies on Stephenson, which were intensively made from every clinical angle, started on February the 13th, 1928. Stephenson was tested during the experiment with an excessively high protein, minimal fat diet, and as a result became ill.
Stephenson said the only time that he felt ill was when he ate too much lean meat, not accompanied by the fat, but that some thick steaks made him feel better again.
You have to have fat with a lean. Lean and fat together make a perfect diet.
At the end, there were 6 publications that came out of that experiment by different doctors looking at whether or not they got enough vitamins and minerals and everything they could possibly measure, and they were found to be in perfect health.
Excessive meat eating is not only not injurious, Dr. Lieb says, but the experiments tended to show that health was improved, resistance to disease strengthened, and the subjects underwent no variation from normal health.
I wanted to try to dispel from the world the same misconceptions which I had of the Arctic when I went north. I used to think that I was well informed on the Arctic before I went north, but I concluded eventually that out of 10 things that I believed about the Arctic before I went north, about 6 were wrong.
The medical community has been promoting saturated fat as being the bad actor for heart disease, mainly. And that really came from weak science called epidemiology. The experimental evidence that shows that that's actually true has never been done. I mean, for example, you could radio label saturated fat in the food and see if it shows up on the arteries. That's never been done. The entire teaching about saturated fat being bad for the heart is not really founded in good science.
It's not that the information is not out there. I remember early on when I was in college, I had a college professor explain to us that fat was our body's preferred source of energy. Okay, fat is a very good way to have energy. And that same professor a couple of weeks later said, our bodies prefer sugar when we do exercise. Weren't we talking about fat just a couple of weeks ago? Yeah, forget about all that. It's sugar. So the message, even in top universities right here in the United States, are a bunch of mixed messages. Do I think there's a big responsibility for media to do the right thing? Yes, I do. You know, we had 3 big networks, the big 3, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Whatever they told us, we went with. Hell, when I was a kid, there was still even cigarette commercials on the air. At least we figured out that that was a bad idea.
Don't settle for summer taste, summer time.
It's very easy to see how someone can think something or just say something and that becomes a reality.
Breakfast. No eggs or fatty meats. Instead, eat grains and fiber that actually lower cholesterol.
How about the term heart-healthy grains? We've all seen it. Many people believe it. After all, the terms come from studies that prove it to be true, right?
Those were studies looking at whole grains versus white processed flours and grains. So of course, when you're comparing it to something like white processed flour, it's going to be better. But does that mean it in and of itself is therefore heart healthy?
You could make the argument that whole grains are less bad for you than refined grains, but that doesn't make whole grains good.
Oatmeal or oat bread or an oat muffin or oat bran that is either incorporated into some other cereal product.
It's like cigarettes. You can have cigarettes with a filter on and they're less bad for you perhaps than unfiltered cigarettes. Doesn't make the filtered cigarettes good. It just means they're less bad. And the same thing is true for whole grains. They are less bad.
We should put more emphasis on our vegetables. We should think about the vegetables we're going to have for dinner rather than the meat portion.
Listen, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a guy with a physical education degree who became a trainer and somehow found myself in the world of modeling. Before I became a trainer to the stars and eventually a best-selling author and podcaster. But when I started modeling in LA in the early 90s, I realized that the media would sell us anything to make a buck, regardless of whether it's healthy or not. Let's face it, every beer commercial you've ever seen is a bunch of ripped up guys on the beach playing volleyball because that's what beer drinkers look like. If you have ripped up abs or you have a nice set of shoulders, they want you modeling everything in the infomercials. It was the heyday of the infomercials.
If we think fat, then we are.
Bad diets, powders, pills, still my weight's been up and down like a yo-yo until the AIDS plan taught me how to take off weight and help keep it off.
Just 20 minutes a day will turn your body into a calorie-burning furnace.
We were coming into this age of, hey, if you just do what I tell you, you can look like this guy or this woman in just a few weeks.
Dextran did it. I lost weight and feel great.
Nobody wanted the truth. They just wanted a lie that they could get everyone to believe.
Now you can lose weight without diets.
No, this product really doesn't work.
Without pills.
No, that product really doesn't work.
Without exercise.
Well, what does work?
Now you can lose weight just by watching television.
So I learned very quickly, be careful as to what you advertise. The 1920s and 30s, it was a lot different. We were learning a lot of things back then. We were discovering vitamins for the first time. We also learned that food could heal. And a lot of these therapies are what were being used to heal people. They were using non-starchy, non-sugary diets to starve cancer in the 1920s and 30s. Take Otto Warburg, for instance. He was doing cancer studies on rats. He thought that the outcome would be that oxygen was what was fueling cancer cells to grow. And what he learned with rats was that it was actually the sugar.
In the healthy cell, glucose is split into carbon dioxide and water. The tumor cell, however, is able to split glucose into lactic acid, and so, in a certain sense, get along without oxygen, and at the same time, obtain the necessary energy from its food. This is true not only in tumor cells separated from the body, but also true of tumors in animals and human beings.
His discovery was well known as the Warburg effect, and it was shown to help in somewhere near 80% of the cases of people who had cancer. Why does it feel like no one knows this information? We were making these discoveries, so what else contributed to them not taking hold? We had a Great Depression, and then we had a war. A lot of people were having trouble putting food in their mouth, period. So I don't think people were caring that much about their health. People were just trying to eat anything. People didn't eat out as much. We made homemade dressings. You didn't have dressings that were full of processed oils, and we weren't adding high fructose corn syrup to everything that we ate. We ate real whole foods that were cooked at home. Even fast food was different back in the 1940s and 50s. If you had French fries, they were made from rendered animal fat, basically beef tallow, which was a better way to cook junk food. So even our junk food was better in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. It wasn't until we got to the 1950s where people started to become more prosperous. We saw the advent of TV dinners and all this stuff, and more sugar, and processed foods came from everywhere. But what really happened in 1955, when one of the most popular presidents of our time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had a heart attack.
News of President Eisenhower's sudden illness, described by his doctors as coronary thrombosis, came as a severe shock to us all.
Films of President Eisenhower made just before his heart attack are dramatic evidence of the suddenness of the illness that shocked the nation.
President Eisenhower's heart attack struck at a time when he was close to the zenith of his prestige at home and abroad. It follows that the president's illness is of vital concern to the entire world.
Well, if he could die, what could happen to me?
You have to understand, this is a period in the 1950s when America is in a complete panic about the rising tide of heart disease.
Before that, we never thought about heart attacks. We never thought about health and fitness. We didn't think about the food we were eating. No one back in the 1950s knew what their cholesterol score was, much less even knew what the word cholesterol meant.
Medical textbooks tell us that cholesterol is a white compound, somewhat soapy to the touch, and is distantly related to alcohol.
It is no alien poison to be avoided by man at any cost, but an important element in the body's chemical machinery.
Cholesterol is a kind of a fat-type molecule. It's in all of our cells, 30 trillion cells.
Cholesterol is actually so important to the body that it actually makes the majority of cholesterol that's in your blood right now. Most of the dietary cholesterol you eat will go through you, and very little actually gets absorbed. And of that cholesterol you find in the blood, most of it was made by your liver.
It is an essential of nerve tissue, for instance, and a raw material for the production of several hormones, bile, and a form of vitamin D. It is found naturally in the blood, and also often in the walls of arteries and other blood vessels.
If you eat more cholesterol, your body will make less. If you eat less, your body will make more, which makes it very interesting that it was so maligned in the past few decades.
Heart disease had been rare in the early 1900s and had really risen since the late 1920s to be the #1 killer disease by the 1950s.
We took a collective gasp in this country. We didn't want to have another president die in office.
Just imagine your president not being in the Oval Office for 10 days and he's in bed.
Besides, this guy was very popular. People wanted to find out what caused it. Could it have been his diet? And if so, what was he eating and how can we change it? This is also the time when the media was more prevalent.
Motion picture cameras join newspaper reporters in the old State Department building for an historic presidential press conference. The first ever filmed in sound by newsreel cameramen.
Well, I see we're trying a new experiment this morning. I hope it doesn't prove to be a disturbing influence.
The power of media. You can't really tell that story without telling the story of Oprah Winfrey. It was 1993, and by happenstance, I was put up for an appearance on Oprah. They needed someone the next day. They were looking for younger men who were dating older women. And since my girlfriend was 7 years older at the time, I was invited on. I wasn't into it. I had no idea what really happened on Oprah. But I was told, no, you have to do it. It'll be great for your career. So they fly me to Chicago, and I get to the green room. I was introduced to a woman named Doe. The theme of the show was younger men who were dating older women.
Older women having the courage to live their dreams and fulfill their fantasies and live their lives exactly the way they wanted to, including dating younger men.
Doe said that I would have to pretend that I was dating her. And I said, what are you talking about?
My guests today, they're all members of a provocative new kind of dating service.
I told her that I would not go on stage and lie. I would go on stage and sit next to Doe, but I would not say that we dated. I quickly realized that I'd been bamboozled because Doe introduced me as her boyfriend.
I'd like you to meet Vinnie Tortorich. He's a Beverly Hills fitness expert. He's hot, sweet, he loves women, and he's emotionally accessible.
Get out of here. I couldn't believe what was happening. And at that moment, I said to myself, I'm going to turn this into not the Oprah show, but the Vinnie show.
Number one, women don't even hit their sexual prime until they hit 40. They don't even know what's going on until they're 40. I've been dating older women.
Gee, I'm only 39.
I'm going to make this show so bad that they won't possibly be able to run it on national television.
You want to be with an older woman, it's the difference between riding in a Volkswagen and a Cadillac. If you want to ride in a Volkswagen, go right ahead. If you want the Cadillac, go for the older woman.
Well, now.
It turned into a circus. The people in the audience actually believed all this. Doe and I had just met. It was like the audience was participating in this huge game of Mad Libs.
Two different generations. How was school? Oh, I learned arithmetic. I don't see how two people can have something in common if they're not the same age.
It seems like people are treating this like some sort of fetish.
What could you possibly have in common?
Let's say Cher walked into the room and said she had to have you. Sally, get Cher on the phone.
I ended up asking Cher out on a date during the show.
Cher is on the phone.
Cher, my name is Vinnie Tortorich. I want to say this in front of the whole country. Is the camera on me?
Yeah, camera's on.
Cher, I live in Beverly Hills. Let's get together and have lunch. I'll have my agent call your agent, and we'll do it because we'll have a great time.
No matter how outlandish I got, they seemed to enjoy it more and more.
What I want to know is from the ladies in the audience, should I have lunch with this guy?
As a matter of fact, you can see Oprah. Oprah started dancing in the aisles.
The
The show ended and I went back to LA and I just assumed, well, that show is going to bomb. As of last year, it was the 7th highest rated show in Oprah's history. People still recognize me for it today, and virtually none of it was true. I took that realization that media can change everything. Eisenhower has a heart attack, and he wants the whole country to know that this was a real issue.
I am happy the doctors have given me at least a parole, if not a pardon, and I expect to be back at my accustomed duties, although they say I must ease my way into them and not bulldoze my way into them.
But the media had other ideas. They have their own agenda. He had the common cold of heart attacks. He didn't really have a bad one. The media was trying to show him on the golf course, having a great round of golf.
It was thought that diet was the cause. He was also like a 4-pack a day smoker, which may very well have given him his heart attack.
Yes, according to this survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Try Camels yourself.
Right around that time enters Ansel Keys.
Ansel Keys was a pathologist at the University of Minnesota. He got the idea in the 1950s that saturated fat and cholesterol were what caused heart disease.
It strikes without warning. Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
Ansel Keys was this incredibly persuasive person. He had a really outsized belief in his own ideas.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
Ansel Keys was famous for something called the 7-country study. This is where he went and studied 7 different countries and came up with this hypothesis as to how we're supposed to eat based on correlation.
Ansel Keys is the one who proposed what he called the diet heart hypothesis, and that was that saturated fat and cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, would give you a heart attack, especially saturated fat, like hot oil down a cold stovepipe. It would just clog up your arteries and give you a heart attack.
The problem is he cherry-picked these countries to fit what he was trying to hypothesize. It set out to prove that the more calories you got from fat, the better chance you had of getting heart disease. It seemed like a straight line between the least fat consumed and the most fat consumed, with the U.S. at the top. The only problem is Keys studied 22 countries. And if you factor in all of those countries, the results were all over the place. He just took the 7 countries that proved this point, that fat causes heart disease. This study made Keys the temporary savior of the medical community, and therefore the world.
Such that he was able to get onto the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee, and he turned the whole association around in 1 year and got them in 1961 to recommend that all Americans restrict saturated fat and cholesterol in their diets in order to fight heart disease.
Dietary fat and its relation to heart attacks and strokes. Most persons in the United States who are overweight will find it profitable to reduce their total caloric intake. Reducing the amount of fat in the diet is one way to do this.
This is the first advice anywhere in the world telling people not to eat saturated fat and cholesterol to fight heart attacks. That's like the beginning of it all. That is what just blossomed, bloomed, grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have now.
We have no credible evidence to say that saturated fat causes heart disease. And that sounds crazy to say when you look at our government guidelines and our dietary guidelines, but there is no high-level, credible evidence to show that saturated fat causes heart disease.
The interesting thing about Keys, he got virtually everything wrong, but it never infected his humility.
We live in a time right now when we've had a narcissistic turn. People are very primitive and narcissistic, a lot of injuries in childhood. And it has caused us to perhaps not have the most secure sense of self and identity. People attach themselves to one particular approach to diet, and it develops into an identity around which people maintain a religious intensity. They defend it as though any question in their dogma is like you're questioning their religious dogma or threatening their very sense of the fabric of reality. And so we start looking around for things to attach ourselves to, and political groups, religious organizations, with different diet fads, we attach ourselves to these groups, and we look to the groups for our identity. So our going forward in life is somehow threatened by somebody saying, hey, maybe fat's not so bad for you. It's positively comedic, but it's becoming ridiculous.
In the United States, coronary heart disease is so common that all one has to do to study the complete natural history of the disease is to take a sample of men, any sample of men that are now healthy, follow them, wait a little while, and a lot of them will have coronary heart disease.
Well, it wasn't very long before it appeared that there was some connection between coronary heart disease and cholesterol in the blood.
No question, we hear over and over and over again that cholesterol equals mortality. We've seen it in the commercials.
Fleischmann's margarine. It's the only leading margarine made from 100% corn oil. It has no cholesterol.
We've heard about it from our doctor.
Over time, they build up on the walls of veins and arteries, helping to clog them, restricting blood flow. It's what causes heart attacks and strokes.
We've heard about it plenty of times from our friends and our family. And because of that, we tend to think it's just simply the truth. It certainly has the degree of repetition that we would expect.
In the 60s and 70s, we were focusing more on the specific types of cholesterol, LDL and HDL. And LDL became known as the bad cholesterol. And all of a sudden, medicine was focused on LDL.
It was noticed that higher cholesterol in the blood appeared to correlate or track with higher heart disease rates.
Cholesterol is carried in the blood by proteins called low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs. The more cholesterol we eat, the more the number of LDLs, and that's dangerous.
So essentially the idea was developed that the higher cholesterol was getting into your arteries and was causing arterial disease.
Because the higher that lipoprotein level goes, the greater the risk of heart disease.
There are some studies that show a correlation. Does that mean causation? And this is a very important differentiation that is too infrequently made. Because something is correlated doesn't mean it is the cause. So if high cholesterol is present in people who are having heart disease, we have to look a little further as to why that is and if there are other factors. When you really look at the studies and you crunch the data, LDL is not the best marker for heart disease. What's even more powerful are your ratios. So whether it's your total cholesterol to HDL ratio or your triglyceride to HDL ratio, those have better predictive value than LDL itself.
The ratios indicate your level of insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. So the best cholesterol measures are not actually even talking about a cholesterol thing. They are indirectly talking about insulin resistance and health.
A lot of the fat research, look, we saw fat in the coronary arteries and we thought that fat must be coming from somewhere. It must come from circulating fat and that must come from ingested fat. It was a very simplistic kind of idea.
The contrary opinion, the alternative hypotheses, which has been around for a couple hundred years, is that we get fat because we eat carbohydrates like pasta, potatoes, bread. They used to be called simple carbohydrates. Now the terminology is changing to adjust to the fact that a lot of people think maybe these starches, as my mother called them, are not quite so good for us. We focused in, just by timing and bad luck, on this idea that saturated fat causes heart disease. And we bought into it even though the evidence ultimately didn't really support it. And we made everything else we believed about diet have to be reconciled with that.
Dr. Key's singling out of excessive consumption of fats as a major factor in coronary disease is by no means accepted by all investigators.
In front of us, day by day, are increasingly more and more very tempting foods.
In the mid-1960s, John Yudkin comes on the scene. He's a British scientist. He thinks sugar's the problem.
When people have heart disease, they don't just have elevated cholesterol. In fact, they often don't have elevated cholesterol. They have a whole cluster of metabolic abnormalities. 10, 15, 20 things you could measure. And Yudkin was saying, if I feed animals sugar or I feed college students that I'm using in my experiments sugar, I could cause pretty much all of these things just by giving them a lot of sugar.
See, up to, say, 200 or 300 years ago, the average consumption of sugar in this country was about 4 pounds a year. And that's splendid. I'd be very happy if everybody had 4 pounds of sugar a year. They eat 100 pounds.
Comparative studies of the diet of 41 nations have convinced Professor Yudkin that there is an almost exact relationship between the consumption of fat and sugar.
Moreover, many sugar-containing foods, cakes, candies, cookies, chocolate, ice cream, various kinds of puddings also contain fat.
You always eat some fat. So if you eat high-carb foods, you raise your blood glucose, you raise your fat-storing hormone insulin, and you're going to store the fat that you eat. It's all individual how much you can tolerate, but if you eat more than your body can tolerate, then you will most likely gain weight, gain fat.
Drawing the analogy of the relationship between diabetes and national sugar intakes that could statistically also be related to the fat intake, Professor Yudkin considers that heart disease may well be causally related to the consumption of sugar.
And instead of looking at it, Ansel Keys just jumps right on top of it in the media and turns this guy into a nut job.
Keys was really a bully when it came to trying to quash anybody who opposed him.
Ansel Keys wasn't going to let anyone come in and rain on his parade.
He published a 9-page rebuttal in a journal called Atherosclerosis. In print, he said Yudkin is a mountain of nonsense.
It is clear that Yudkin has no theoretical basis or experimental evidence to support his claim for a major influence of dietary sucrose in the etiology of heart disease.
Keys and his colleagues managed to paint Yudkin as a quack and to portray Yudkin and his sugar theory as quackery and to say there was absolutely no evidence to support it.
None of what is said here should be taken to mean approval of the common level of sucrose in many diets.
Keys had more political influence and more savvy maybe than Yudkin, and somehow this dietary, and we were spending money testing the dietary fat hypothesis, so even though the tests weren't confirming it, the more money they spent, the more people were wedded to the hypothesis having to be right.
These studies are extremely expensive, and there have been enough good studies done to support our moderate approach, which is looking at balanced foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, and lean meat and dairy products.
The argument, once again, is it has to be tested. When you believe it's wrong, prima facie, you're not going to spend the money to test it.
Why are these nutrition scientists just not more curious about other ideas? You know, I was at a conference recently where we talked about a low-carb study where they reversed the diagnosis of diabetes it was a large university-based study in just 1 year on a very low-carb diet. And not one of them said, wait, what? Diabetes reversal? Wow, how'd you do that? Can you just explain your study a little bit to us? Because that's what we, as nutrition experts, we really need to do in America. And I actually got up to ask a question from the audience. I said, you know, did you hear that? That was 60% reversal of diabetes. Should that not be headline news? And should you not be curious? Why are you not even curious about these ideas?
You know, it makes you think of stories like the McKenzie family, parents in South Dakota who realized they had to take matters into their own hands when their son lost 5 pounds in 5 days.
I called the doctor that morning and I explained that I thought my son had rapidly lost weight and something was wrong. And we knew within 5 minutes of him doing a urinalysis test that there was sugar in his urine. And we were escorted to the hospital to learn how to manage our new life.
We both concluded that we were going to make drastic changes in our diet, reducing carbohydrate intake. Shortly thereafter, we were told that we didn't need to do that we could feed our son, recently diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, whatever he wanted to eat.
Take a look. Oh, okay. I'm trusting these people who are now in charge of caring for my son, and they're telling me, give him pancakes and give him French fries and cupcakes and pizza, because now that your kid has this disease, his life is pretty crummy already. And the worst thing you could do as a parent is to try and change his food. I fed my kid the exact prescribed amount of carbohydrates. I pre-bolused his insulin. I put a continuous glucose monitor on him. I bought him a diabetes alert dog. I literally did everything in my own capacity to follow the guidelines and manage his disease, and I failed miserably.
Riv, do you want the yogurt, the tablets, or the gel?
I put a big message out in the social media groups that I'm connected to in the diabetes community, and I asked, how are you people achieving normal blood sugars? What are you doing? And about every 5th answer I got was that these people were changing their children's diet and implementing a very, very low-carb diet. We We removed all the processed carbs, the flour, the sugar, the grains, the fruit, anything that would spike his blood sugar. And so the next appointment we had with our endocrinologist, I skipped in there like I had won the lottery. Oh my goodness, I stumbled upon a low-carb diet and look at my son's blood sugars. And during that appointment, our very kind-hearted doctor looked at me and told me my son was going to resent me for the rest of his life, that this way of eating is not sustainable, that I'm subjecting my son to an eating disorder, and he also handed me a business card to go see a therapist because he thought maybe I was struggling with some things and had some issues for wanting to do this for my son and to change his diet. And I'm told to follow these guidelines because without those carbohydrates, my child won't grow properly and his brain function will be compromised. So when you're a parent of a type 1 and you're told the American Diabetes Association, this large governing body that must know exactly what we're up against, they're recommending this, that's intimidating.
We either had to make a change or accept mediocre care. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. It seems now as if it's the patients that are trying to make the medical community aware of what they already know, of what the patients know, because they have tried to follow the rules as given to them and they failed. When somebody comes to me with a belief that they tell me, I believe your son is going to do better if you feed them more carbohydrates, I know they're wrong. And when it comes to my son, I'm going to do what I know as opposed to what they believe.
Our son went from taking 45 to 50 units of insulin every day to maybe 15 units of insulin.
If you extrapolate that over every child with this disease, you can understand that that's going to have a marked effect on the profitability of the disease.
I think we underestimate people's ability to make a change. And I think if there were doctors and nurses and dietitians who are willing to give patients that option, I think the face of diabetes would be different.
We're a very weird culture because we have an endless amount of energy to talk about almost everything. But when it comes to the core issues and the ones that just affect everything, such as family or such as diet, we have, we just went through an election. We talked about everything, but no one ever talked about diet or family or any of this stuff.
Now you have kids with type 2 diabetes. You have fatty liver disease. You have sleep apnea. None of this stuff existed before. And if you think it's just old people using this, it's getting younger and younger and younger.
It's an epidemic, and it's one of those things like, hey, powers that be, hey, folks in charge, this is going to break the bank.
How do people scream all day about Medicare and this doesn't come up?
Never comes up.
Because it's not sexy. Voted. It doesn't work.
No, you want votes? Telling people like hard news, like, hey, mom, you're poisoning your kid. Get your shit together. No votes for you.
The current recommendations, it started in the late 60s in response to a documentary that aired on CBS News called Hunger in America.
This spring, a private agency, the Citizens Board of Inquiry, released an exhaustive report claiming that serious hunger exists many places in the United States. Out of a total population of 200 million, the report states, 30 million Americans are impoverished, with family income below $3,000 a year. 5 million of these people are helped by 2 existing federal food programs. Now, a new figure must be added. Of the 30 million who are impoverished, 10 million Americans, whether or not they are reached by federal aid, are hungry. The federal food program might be better administered by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or by a special commission whose only concern would be to see that hungry Americans are fed.
This leads right to 1968 in the McGovern Committee. Public calls to address the issue of hunger had been building ever since Robert F. Kennedy had toured the devastated slums of Mississippi.
It's obviously as great a poverty as we've had, and they're going to lead a very difficult, unhappy life through the rest of their existence.
But it was George McGovern, the senator from South Dakota, who would head a committee that started in 1968. Privy to the poverty that the nation was now aware of, the former director of Food for Peace in JFK's administration was intent on bringing change that would eventually affect all of us.
It's always bothered me to see hungry people in the world. I like to eat.
If we are to save ourselves in this country, it seems to me that a radical restructuring of our policies and priorities is absolutely necessary.
There is nothing more to say, really. Senator Kennedy died at 1:44 this evening.
We've got to draw the line at violence, so I have mixed emotions. I'm supporting the president as he tries to bring this war to a close.
It was quite sad, really, to break up with the Beals, because to see it just fall apart was sad.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
When you think of 1972, 1973, we're still in Vietnam. It's not a popular war. Then 1972 comes around and we have Watergate.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
People were just in a haze about diet. No one was really paying attention to this McGovern committee. You know, we had bigger problems. This complacency at the time is what allowed these health myths to seep in.
As you know, I represent all sorts of delicious things. Greasy bacon, potato chips, French fried potatoes, fatty meat, and gobs of butter on everything. Now, as you know, us fat separately are just little guys. But put us all together, and what do you have?
You have millions of calories, that's what. I have to store those calories as fat, and I can't take it anymore. I'm getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
And the bigger he gets, the harder us heart cells have to work. Mr. Fat, you're a real killer.
You know, I don't know the answer, but why is it whenever a new study comes out, it's always talking about how food is going to kill you? I think that's a major misdirection to what we should be focused on. Food should be used to prevent illness, not to just help reverse it once it's too late. One of the areas we haven't talked about until recently is how food can affect your brain health.
I became interested in mental health and the connection between mental health and diet after I had developed a lot of my own health problems and had changed my diet and discovered that diet had a lot more to do with health and mental health than I had ever been taught that it had. In my early 40s, about 10 years ago, I developed a number of mysterious symptoms that I think a lot of people, especially middle-aged women, will identify with. So things like chronic pain, fibromyalgia, IBS, chronic fatigue, migraines, lots of different symptoms that all of my very smart Harvard-affiliated doctors couldn't help me with. After about 6 months of trial and error, I arrived at this diet that was completely upside down from what I had been taught was good for me. It was basically a mostly meat diet, high in meat and fat and cholesterol. And when I arrived at that diet, all of the symptoms that I'd been struggling with completely went away. And I thought, you know, this diet actually is also improving my mental health, and I'm a psychiatrist. The most powerful way to change your brain chemistry would be through food, because that's where brain chemicals come from in the first place. If you're getting most of your sugar and most of your glucose from the outside of the body, you run the risk of getting spikes, peaks and troughs in your blood sugar and insulin level, and those can destabilize brain chemistry. So those can create mood swings, insomnia, irritability, changes in appetite throughout the course of the day. When you eat a ketogenic diet, you're using fat primarily for energy, and the brain is using, to a large extent, ketones instead of glucose.
Today, if you're anywhere near Google, you will learn that this is known as dietary ketosis.
Most healthcare professionals are familiar with ketoacidosis, and that's a state where the body is out of control. Diabetes is out of control. Blood glucose is through the roof. Insulin is not able to keep up with this glucose derangement, and so that's a life-threatening state when you're type 2 diabetic out of control. Nutritional ketosis is quite a different scenario. Blood sugars are absolutely under control. The patient is healthy in every single way. Electrolytes, insulin, glucose, perfectly controlled. We have now trained the body to switch over from burning carbohydrate as the primary fuel. Now the individual becomes fat adapted, and they use fat as the primary source of energy, and that's really the difference between a very unhealthy and a very healthy state.
We had a scientific question in the 1960s where the researchers asked the wrong question, but there were questions we needed answered.
We know that the way you gain weight is you take in more calories than you burn. And those calories can be fat or they can be carbohydrate.
And so they get this hypothesis, which sounds reasonable, that fat people get fat because they accumulate a little bit of extra calories every day. And we could get back to this by not asking how much extra calories. They don't have to really confront the problems with the hypothesis. And that becomes a theory ever since. The history of science, once again, is full of commonsensical facts that turned out to be dead wrong when we did the science. You're certain, you use words like "it proves." When you look at the data, it either isn't there or we just didn't do the experiment.
Speaking of experiments, here's a timeline of events that happened with the McGovern Committee. After a year of fighting for funding, the committee operations began in 1969. There were Democrats and Republicans, including future presidential candidates George McGovern, Walter Mondale, and Bob Dole. The initial goals of the committee centered around hunger and malnutrition, and this led to the legislation in 1970 with principles of free food stamps and nationwide standards for eligibility. It was in 1971 that the committee expanded to focus on eating habits in poor neighborhoods. But in 1972, this extremely pressing issue was put on hold so that McGovern can run for president. When he lost 49 states to Richard Nixon, who would eventually resign and be replaced by this guy, it was back to fixing America's health.
In 1973, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs began to hold hearings on the American diet and heard dozens of eminent doctors and scientists linking cholesterol to heart disease.
Unfortunately, dietary guidelines were based on this singular focus to lower cholesterol. While we're treating heart disease by supposedly lowering bad cholesterol, we're going to help people lose weight.
If you tell a public of 215 million people what they're eating is going to kill them, they're going to probably listen. And the unintended consequence is that someone is going to step in and take advantage of these people when it doesn't work, right?
Coincidentally, drug companies were spending millions of dollars developing drugs to target LDL.
In the 80s and 90s, a class of drugs was invented called the statins, and these drugs did lower the cholesterol very effectively, and they also were shown to lower heart disease rates.
But the question that's probably more interesting to me, that I think should be more interesting to you, is does it help you live longer?
It might reduce heart attacks by 20 or 30% at best, and it doesn't really reduce mortality much.
We like simple answers that we have treatments for, but that's not where the best evaluation and treatment for heart disease is.
It's absolutely amazing to me the trajectory of statins and low-fat diets with everything we have today stemmed from a committee that was focused on poverty and people who weren't getting enough to eat. And somehow cholesterol got into the mix thanks to Ancel Keys. And in a complete U-turn, in 1974, they expanded the committee to focus on overnutrition.
The very recommendations made led to people eating way too much of the wrong kind of food. So now we have just the opposite problem. We don't have a hunger problem. We have an obesity epidemic.
The Senate committee finally issued a set of dietary goals in December 1977. The McGovern Committee issued a set of nutritional guidelines for all Americans, intended to battle heart disease, cancers, strokes, high blood pressure, obesity. In the dietary guidelines for Americans, they recommend fewer calories, less fat, less saturated fat, less cholesterol, more polyunsaturated fat.
All in favor of nominating vegetable oils, say aye.
Less sugar, less salt, more fiber, more starchy food.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day.
This great experiment we were doing with tax dollars seemed to have one idea repeated over and over. Cholesterol is bad, cholesterol is bad, on its own or in conjunction with other things.
One way to look at it is that saturated fats are healthy when you're not eating carbohydrates, or that saturated fat was never unhealthy all along, but that gets you into the realm of you're telling people that what they've believed is wrong.
As time has gone on, both doctors and private citizens have done their own experiments.
As a software engineer, I look a lot at networks. Networks are basically objects talking to each other. And a lot of understanding a network is kind of like understanding a brain. No one cell in the brain controls your whole body. That actually cholesterol was part of a larger network of objects and how it is that they can move about to provide us what we need.
Another thing we don't talk about is how complicated the human body is. For the government to even recommend what you should be eating in the first place is one thing, but for them to do it in such a simplistic way is another. You know, there were certain scientists that had some hypotheses, and they said, well, some of the stuff we're looking at is leaning towards red meat might be bad for your heart. The commission would say, well, what do you think?
Doctors took issue with that at the hearing, saying that 8 studies involving 5,000 patients failed to show hard medical evidence that diet has anything to do with heart attacks.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Yes, before you make announcements to the public, you should have data that proves what you're saying. Maybe like Dave Feldman did.
My story is a bit interesting. I found that I could move my cholesterol up and down with the dietary fat that I ate. So the more fat I ate, the lower my LDL-C. The less fat I ate, the higher my LDL-C.
On a 3-day diet of over 5,000 calories and 450 grams of fat, he lowered every marker of cholesterol.
I eventually got a number of other people to replicate this. The success rate is somewhere around 85% of those people went on a low-carb, high-fat diet, fatty cheeses, fatty meats, fatty nuts. And in doing so, even though their calories increased substantially, even though their saturated fat just jumped through the roof, their LDL-C and their total cholesterol plummeted. It's very unintuitive, but sure enough, the more fat they would eat, the lower their LDL-C.
Dave Feldman is not a doctor at all. This guy took all of the science that was available and figured it out. Yet members of a publicly funded committee took 10 years to find nothing. And when they were pressured to change recommendations with no science to back it up, they ran around in circles for a while and came out with the same report, but this time they said, oh, you can have some meat and some salt.
I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
So there you have it, the national advice that everything you see today is based on.
That report was then taken over to become official government policy. So it went over to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and by 1980, they came out with the policy, which was the dietary guidelines for all Americans. I think it's audacious that the government, based on very weak evidence, should tell Americans what to eat, a healthy population at the time.
How do you tell some guy from the Midwest who's been living on beef his entire life to start eating vegetables? Especially at that time, you couldn't get them year-round. You couldn't get fruit year-round. It wasn't like it is today where we refrigerate and ship fruits and vegetables around the world. You're telling people from different parts of the United States what to do, how to do it, and everyone's just throwing their hands up going, I'm going to do the best I can. Do I think the government was complicit in causing this problem? Yes. Do I think they meant to do it? Absolutely not. I think McGovern's heart was in the right place. They just went the wrong way about it.
But we went on that experiment, and the government put us on that experiment. They didn't ask us about it. They didn't ask our advice. They just told us how to eat, and they told the food industry, asked the food industry to produce low-fat food products.
Industry slowly is responding to it, producing foods that are lower in salt and fat and so on, and people are beginning to get the message.
Low cholesterol, no cholesterol, lowers cholesterol.
Good fat, bad fat, low fat, non-fat.
Milk suddenly came and, bewildering number of varieties, all of them reduced in fat. And whether or not it was a result of the experiment, this coincided with the obesity and explosions in obesity and diabetes we've been seeing today.
The 1980s brought in all sorts of brand new foods.
There's a Dannon body in everybody. Unlike some yogurts, it's low in fat.
The whole thought pattern was, if you didn't eat fat, you couldn't get fat.
Not having fat does not automatically make something a health food. And that's where we get into this debate about, is it just calories in, calories out? Does it not matter what we eat as long as we're burning enough calories to burn it off?
And we still didn't know if eating a low-fat diet was a good thing. It was some of the smartest scientists and the president of the National Academy of Sciences in the late 1970s called this a huge experiment in which the American public were the subjects.
The American has an infinite number of combination of choices with which he can constitute a healthy diet.
Unfortunately, he also has an infinite number of
of combinations from which he can choose an unbalanced diet.
Let's examine why there is so much confusion about good nutrition. One reason is that we have been given a lot of misinformation, usually by those looking to make a profit. Today, there are still many unusual ideas as to what we should eat. People tend to believe that just because it's in print or on television, it must be true.
The 80s also brought in all sorts of new fitness trends.
Make the commitment now and watch how fast you see results. Are you ready to do the workout?
We couldn't get enough of fitness in the 1980s, but although we were doing all of this, we weren't getting any thinner.
Our sugar consumption increases in part with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup, and that's an unintended consequence of these government actions. It's arguably the case if they had done nothing, we wouldn't have had this epidemic. We might have had it anyway, but they probably or almost assuredly made it worse. For 25 years, we've been pushing a low-fat dogma. It said, eat less fat. First it said, eat less total fat, and you'll have less heart disease, less cancer, and you'll weigh less. Then
Well, that's not exactly true. This started because there's incontrovertible evidence that saturated fat is bad, and that is well established in long-term trials.
you build up in a community, institutions, organizations, everybody collects to them people who think just like they do. Like, we like each other, we respect each other because we think alike. You know, I know nothing about you other than that you think like I do, so I respect the way you think. And institutions do this. And then somebody else comes along from the outside and says, oh, you guys all got it wrong. And look, here's the evidence. All these obese, diabetic people are neck deep in obesity and diabetes. We got to change everything. It's hard to accept. It's hard to back out of. There's no way to back out of it that doesn't destroy your credibility.
In this country, we have freedom of choice to say what we want to say. We have freedom of choice to print what we want to print. We have freedom of choice to think what we want to think, but we do not have freedom of choice for our own health care. Why? I guess profit and politics and power. The MDs and nutritionists and all people need to work together for the total benefit of this country's health.
So in 1992, we did the most brilliant thing we've ever done as a country. We started the food pyramid. Now, this is so ridiculous that I can't even ever remember, because in my own mind, it makes no sense. I always have to read it off of a piece of paper. The pyramid, at the base, the biggest part, was bread, cereal, and rice. 6 to 11 servings, not per week, hang on folks, per day. If you went to the max on vegetables, that's 5 vegetables a day, 5 servings. And fruit, if you went to the max, that's 4. That's 20 servings of carbohydrates every day. And then when you get into milk and dairy, milk has carbohydrates, there's lactose in milk. That's like drinking sugar. And on meat, the most you can have in any given day is 3 servings. Now it gets even worse, because we start wondering this, what's a serving? What's a serving of meat? They didn't tell you how many ounces. Well, I can tell you it was 2 to 3 ounces per serving, but who knew that?
You gotta eat the right stuff. Start with a little meat, a little dairy. You gotta add a bunch of fruit.
You have Timon and Pumbaa telling people to eat more grains.
Bread, cereal, rice, noodles.
And eat a whole lot less fat. And if you thought that was ridiculous, the servings that they did give us with the food pyramid did not match what the government told us that servings should be on the packages of food. Those servings, which were also mandated by the government, were completely different from the servings that we heard about when it came to what was on the pyramid.
The new food label represents nothing less than a major victory for the consumer and for the public health.
When you're given a percentage and you see that this is 50% or this is 10% of your expected daily total, then you know very quickly that this food either contributes a lot of fat or a little bit of fat, and how to plan the rest of your diet around this particular food.
This food label, which will be on virtually all foods, will be a benchmark for nutrition information well into the 21st century.
The government makes the manufacturers put the product ingredient list in the amount in which it appears on the package. If the number one thing in it is grains, you will see rice first. If the second thing is sugar, you will see sugar second. These companies got really smart at some point and figured out, hey, wait a minute, we can't do it this way because people are seeing sugar, 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 sugar. So what they do is they name the sugars other things. At last count, we were at 70 names, 70 different names for sugar on packages. Let's say you're diabetic, type 1, type 2, it doesn't matter. If you don't know how to read these labels, your life hangs in a balance. This is the world we live in. This is our society, this is our community. And if we don't fix it, who will? No one will.
The food label has become a veritable minefield of misleading and downright false claims.
And many in Congress feel the same way. They're concerned that any confusion over the truthfulness of health claims could be dangerous because the potential benefit of displaying important health information on food labels would be lost if consumers lose confidence in what they're being told.
When I was a kid in the late 70s, the term metabolic syndrome did not exist at all. Metabolic syndrome is not one thing, it's several things. It's fatty liver disease, it's type 2 diabetes, something else that barely existed in the 70s. We have people on statins and metformin. None of this existed in this quantity in the 70s. We've gone from here to here in just a few short years.
So the same foods that my mother's generation grew up believing would go right to their hips. You know, by the 1980s, we were being told to eat 6 to 11 servings per day. They were the base of the food guide pyramid in the 1990s, and they coincided with this obesity epidemic. I mean, we couldn't have screwed up the science of obesity more if we had tried.
We don't know what to do. Nutrition experts, the establishment, the orthodoxy just doesn't know what to do. So they continue raising money for the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, but they don't have any new ideas. They keep saying, just keep applying the advice that we've given you, and somehow it'll turn out different this time. One of the things that I always say is, why not just be open to new ideas? Like, here's some other ideas coming along. Let's just consider them. Don't we have an obligation to the public to consider, at least, other ideas?
You're about to meet a father who refused to give up, a man who defied the doctors and went looking for a miracle.
My generation remembers Jim Abrams quite well. He did some of our favorite movies like Airplane and Hot Shots and all of these funny movies in the 70s and 80s. Well, it wasn't very funny when Jim Abrams had a 16-month-old son who was having seizure after seizure after seizure. And he was going, because he was a big producer and he had the means, he went to the top doctors in the United States.
And at the time, Charlie was averaging about a dozen seizures a day. He was on 4 anti-epileptic medicines. If you have a critically ill kid, what would your choice be? Do you want to drug him? Do you want to cut his brain? Or do you want to change what he eats? And it just seems so obvious to me.
This is not to blame doctors. Doctors are spread really thin, and they have to try to do the best they can. But it was Jim who figured out on his own by going to a library in the hospital and just happened to open a book to a page that showed the ketogenic diet as being the best way to deal with seizures in infants.
The book claimed that experts here in Baltimore were perfecting something called the ketogenic diet, a diet consisting largely of something most doctors tell us to avoid.
I called Dr. Freeman from Johns Hopkins, told him about Charlie, and he said, send his medical records. We did, and he said, well, bring Charlie out to Hopkins and we'll try the diet. And we started the diet, and in 2 days, the seizures were gone.
2 days?
2 days.
Jim was angry and puzzled that none of the 6 doctors he went to for help ever mentioned the diet.
What has stopped Charlie's seizures has been in existence for 70 years. It's been sitting there. It was waiting for him.
You had some knowledge that this diet was probably working back at Johns Hopkins, and yet you dissuaded the Abrams from attempting it. How come?
Well, because I don't think we had exhausted all of the medical approaches yet. There were actually still other medications that we hadn't tried yet.
Dr. Freeman tells us that 50 to 70% of the patients that come through his doors and get put on the diet have success. Can you think of any drugs in these hard cases that have 50 to 70% success rates?
Probably not anything that comes up to that level.
In another month, Dr. Freeman weaned him off all 4 anti-epileptic medicines, and Charlie went from a prognosis of a lifetime of seizures and what they call progressive retardation to we got our son back and his smile is back and he was happy again and our family could go on with life.
This is Charlie Abrams and his mom, Nancy. I've known him since birth. I've watched his delightful personality emerge through a normal first year. I witnessed his debilitating battle with seizures and medicines. I rejoiced with his family when the ketogenic diet stopped his epilepsy. And now I derive strength and joy like so many of his other friends as we watch him begin to develop again. It's too early to tell whether the 9 months of pummeling from seizures and medicines did any permanent damage to Charlie's brain. If he has anything to say in the matter, I know they won't. However, it's not too early to tell that had Charlie's parents been informed about the existence of the ketogenic diet when he first got sick, and about the success they've had with it at Johns Hopkins, a vast majority of Charlie's seizures would not have occurred, and most of his $100,000 worth of medical, surgical, and drug treatment would not have been necessary.
Even today, 1.5 out of every 10,000 people with epilepsy who would benefit from a ketogenic diet are using it today. Doctors are not taught diet therapy or even nutrition in medical school. They just simply aren't. Try an informal survey on your own. Next time you see a doctor, your doctor, anybody, any doctor, say, when you were in medical school, how long were you, how much time did you spend investigating and learning about nutrition and diet therapy?
I didn't really have much nutritional training like most doctors.
In 4 years of psychiatry training, we didn't talk about food once.
Extent of my training, I got nutrition. Let's see, let's talk about year 1, 2, 3, 4, then 4 years of residency, 0. 0. I got 0 in addiction too. 0 in nutrition, 0 in addiction. We were so damn busy taking care of illness, and trying to push that back and save life that trying to prevent illness was not really on our radar.
I feel anger. I'm pissed off. And again, I think that the reasons that the diet hasn't become more popular has nothing to do with efficacy at all. It has to do with revenue sources that are more lucrative. The ketogenic diet isn't that expensive. The problem is it doesn't generate revenue for the medical world. There are powerful forces at work in our medical system that have nothing to do with good health.
My patients have been getting fatter and sicker over the last few decades, and in particular, we're starting to see diabetes out of control, and that changes everything. I used to see the occasional person who needed diabetic foot ulcer management and needing an amputation, and it started becoming virtually weekly. When you come into a clinic and there's patients with, with rotting flesh, and it is rotting flesh, and it smells bad, it looks bad, and all you're doing is just trimming off a little bit of foot. It starts with a toe, starts with an ulcer, then it moves up the foot, and sometimes you get to a point after doing 2 or 3 operations, it's been going a couple of months, and then the decision is you've actually got to chop that leg off. There's something which really upsets me, and that's when you actually amputate someone's limb, there's a sound of actually dropping that leg into a bucket. I don't want anyone to hear that, that noise. It's just, it's just sickening. I started talking to my patients about reducing sugar, and the benefits were immediate.
Not only would the people's fatty liver disease get better, not only would all of their blood numbers get better, but in fact, he would not have to end up chopping off a foot or a leg.
I then went to the hospital dietitians and said, hang on, this is really exciting, this stuff about sugar. Started talking about it to the staff, and then I started implementing a sugar reduction for my patients, only to find out that I was starting to tread on some big toes. The dietitians then started kicking up a stink about that, involving their parent organisation, the Dietitians Association of Australia, who started becoming involved in pressuring the hospital into silencing me.
We received evidence in Sydney from a medical practitioner in Tasmania, Dr. Gary Fettke. He gave the evidence to the committee in the morning of our hearing in Sydney. 3 hours later, he received an official caution from AHPRA.
The first time I heard the story, I just thought it was a joke. The board's actual statement requires that doctors double-check that their personal beliefs don't compromise care, that they don't put their commercial interest in front of patients, and lastly, doctors should provide appropriate dietary advice.
Ultimately, the medical board made a ruling that I am now the only doctor, as far as we know in the world, to be banned from advising his patients to reduce their sugar and junk food intake. And if that sounds crazy, then that's what it is.
We recognise that the being subject to the notifications process for a practitioner can be an extraordinarily stressful thing, because there are pretty serious issues at stake ultimately in terms of their practice of their profession and
their reputation.
And their reputation. And despite the fact that we are not punitive in our focus, we are protective in our focus, so our mandate is a public protection focus, we understand and appreciate that it may not feel like that for the practitioner involved in the process.
For a long time, I couldn't actually work out why there was anything actually against what I was talking about. Everything about reducing sugar and carbohydrate is basic biochemistry. It's in the first 100 pages of textbooks. There's nothing extreme about it. Once you see the results of reducing sugar and carbs, particularly in diabetes, you can't unsee them.
At this point, I think there is active suppression of this science, and this has been going on since the 60s. One of the things that I found in my research, the biggest ever test of Ansel Keys' hypothesis was something called the Minnesota Coronary Survey. It was on more than 9,000 men and women in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals, which was a really well-controlled study because somebody in a hospital, you can control everything they're eating. They gave half the people what was considered the normal amount of saturated fat, regular milk, regular meat, cheese, butter, etc. The other half, they gave 9% saturated fat, so soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese, soy-filled burgers. They found that the people on the vegetable oil, soy-filled diets, there was no effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. That study was not published for 16 years. One of the principal investigators, Ivan France, was asked by a journalist, "Why did you not publish the study?" He said, "Well, there was really nothing wrong with it. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out." Well, that's that's basically scientific fraud, not publishing your results.
I've started to ask the question, what got in the way? What's withholding the message? Well, there is a pharmaceutical and medical device industry that makes billions selling their products to doctors who have no interest in diet therapy. There is a sugar industry that adds sugar to all of our processed foods that has no interest in promoting a sugar-free diet. There is a cardiology community led by the American Heart Association that has been spreading misinformation about a high-fat diet based on flawed science for over 70 years.
Those diets have been used in children for many years who have epilepsy, and those children show definite cognitive dysfunction. Also, those diets contain
Which means they don't think as clearly.
That's
Those
right.
children are also children who have as many, they're intransigent childhood epilepsy. They have as many as 400 seizures a month. They're untreatable by drugs. They go on the diets, and the diets, I think it cures 33% of them, cures them.
These are epilepsy, and then they aren't able to think.
Today, Charlie is a elementary school teacher, at a certificate in early childhood education. He boxes, he plays piano, and we are beyond grateful every day for his outcome.
I'm not sure what would have become of me if my family hadn't found the ketogenic diet, but I doubt that today I would be an A student in high school with lots of friends. I doubt I would have been playing piano for the last 8 years, and I doubt I could hit an 8-iron 160 yards.
And they just couldn't accept that they were dealing with these intractable conditions. And not just pediatric epilepsy, but obesity is an intractable condition. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes is an intractable condition. Type 1 is, and here you have this diet that appears to put these conditions into remission.
The establishment here, represented by our friends, is a little too dogmatic and that we may never know the truth unless we acknowledge that there is a counter theory that has never been tested, and that theory, more and more people are beginning to accept parts of the theory as being legitimate, and that it could answer a lot of problems, and it could even make it easier for Americans to lose weight.
People are able to reverse diabetes. People are able to lose weight sustainably. Most, if not all, cardiovascular risk factors are improved along the way on a lower carbohydrate diet. That diet ought to be at least considered.
If it turns out to be true, I'll be the first to change my mind, but show me the data.
Well, here's just one study that says that long-term ketosis reduces body weight, triglycerides, LDL, and blood glucose, and shows that it's safe to use a long-term ketogenic diet.
You can lose weight on a plant-based diet, you can lose weight on a ketogenic diet. But are you mortgaging your health when you do that? And the answer is yes. The ketogenic diet, when you look at the arteries of people or animals that go on a ketogenic diet, they tend to be more clogged, even though they may be losing.
Imagine someone who spent his whole career getting the wrong answer. Not only getting the wrong answer, getting a wrong answer that's dangerous, that actually may have killed tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people prematurely. There's no way to tell. And these outsiders come along and say, you're wrong. Not only are you wrong, you're completely wrong, or not even wrong. It's so senseless what you've been doing, and you're killing people, and you have to switch. I don't think any human being, we're just not wired to be able to say, oh yeah, that's a good point, I get it, I see what you're saying, and I'm sorry. And if you're an institution like the American Heart Association, imagine the press release you would have to write, Dear American public, we're sorry if we killed prematurely your loved ones and your parents, and maybe we're killing you, but in retrospect, we shouldn't have given the advice we did. We think about corporations, or our government, which is a corporation, and the first question is, do we blame them? Well, you can't hurt the government's feelings, you can't hurt corporations' feelings, because corporations and governments are not people. They're machines. They're just big, giant machines. And any person in that machine is just a cog, and there's no way to hurt anyone's feelings or to get on anyone's bad side. It's just a machine that keeps running.
Decisions of a nation and of a government that at one time could tolerate 3 or 4 weeks of study now demand almost instantaneous reaction.
The people of the United States recognize, one by one, thousand by thousand, million by million, that this is a problem whose solution is long overdue.
Long before Lyndon Johnson came into position of power, our leaders were recommending great advances in the field of civil rights and great advances in the field of health and things of that nature. I just happen to be the catalyst. We're living in a fast age, and all of us are rather impatient.
I am proposing today a new national health strategy. It emphasizes keeping people well, not just making people well.
I do envision the day when we may use the private health insurance system to offer more middle-income families high-quality health services at prices they can afford, and shield them also from their catastrophic illnesses.
Today I'm proposing to the Congress a national health plan. This major initiative will meet the most urgent needs in health care of the American people.
Our administration will propose to Congress a comprehensive plan to cover catastrophic illnesses.
I am proud to have been part of an administration that passed the first catastrophic health bill.
Whatever form it takes, a catastrophic illness costs money.
There are some little known but very important provisions in this new balanced budget that will take us a tremendous step forward in our fight against diabetes. These investments total more than $2 billion over the next 5 years.
We must remember that the best healthcare decisions are not made by government and insurance companies, but by patients and their doctors.
Because you're eating healthy and you're out there active and you're playing sports and you're out in the playground and doing all those things, not only are you going to have a better life, but you're also helping to create a stronger, healthier America. And that saves us money. It means people are not sick as much. It means that our health care costs go down.
When you roll up at a McDonald's, what does Donald Trump order?
Fish Light sometimes, right? The Big Macs are great, the Quarter Pounder with cheese. I mean, it's great stuff.
Do people at the windows be like, what?
I think all of those places, Burger King, McDonald's, I can live with them. I had the other night, I had Kentucky Fried Chicken, not the worst thing in the world.
If you think it's up to government, you're wrong. If you think it's up to industry, you're wrong. It's up to you. And if you're going to make a change, if you're watching this, change right now, tonight. Don't wait until tomorrow. If it's a Friday night, don't say Monday you're going to start. Start now. There's no time better than right now to get your life in order.
Camera speeds, Vinnie 4, take 1, Mark.
The 20th century gave us so many misconceptions when it came to health.
1 egg equals 5 cigarettes.
Eggs cannot legally even be called safe.
Cutting down on meat is a good idea.
So, is the pendulum swinging back in the opposite direction? Where are we since the last movie came out? Is there progress? Has meat made a comeback? In some cases, I can say yes.
I swear by the ketogenic diet.
I hear more doctors talking about it.
The low-carbohydrate keto community is based on science.
And I can see a few things moving in a direction that people want to see it move into.
There is a bottom-up revolution going on.
But then I see the other side of it. There was another vegan propaganda movie that came out in this past year. Surprise, surprise, there was a product hooked to it.
The Impossible Burger is the world's only burger that looks, handles, smells, cooks, and tastes like ground beef from cows.
People are becoming guinea pigs.
Completely replace animals as a food production technology by 2035.
In Fat Part 1, we talk about the war for information, but I actually think we also live in a war with ourselves. It's almost like we're gaming the system of our own bodies. We're trying to get our system to do what it's not supposed to do. Eat this, eat that. Don't eat this, don't eat that.
Our program is known as a starch-based diet.
Take this supplement, it'll make your muscles grow bigger. We have more questions than ever. And the world always speeds up and it gets more frenzied all the time. And sometimes even the people who are so-called experts don't know what's going on.
You suck it all up.
This study says this. That study says that. Well, that study wasn't done correctly. This is healthy. That's not healthy. The answers we're searching for seem to have these long, winding roads that eventually lead to nothing, but maybe it doesn't have to be so hard. In this movie, we're going to expand on what we talked about in Fat Part 1. We're going to talk to the same experts you saw before. But let them stretch out a little bit.
Great.
We're going to discuss why some of the things we believe are wrong.
Fat tends to cause you to be fat.
We're going to also get into why some of these things are right.
Based on the research, we cannot say with any certainty that eating red or processed meat causes cancer, diabetes, or heart disease.
And also why there's so much confusion between the two. It doesn't have to be that divisive.
My name is Nina Teichels. I'm a science journalist and author of a book called The Big Fat Surprise. I'm also the executive director of a group called the Nutrition Coalition, which aims to ensure that our nutrition policy is evidence-based.
Nina Teichels was a one-time vegan. She crossed over. She crossed the aisle, and that led her into 10 years of research. She went through all the papers. She went through all the studies to come back to figure out where we had gone wrong. And it's the work like her book, Big Fat Surprise, that has led a lot of this pendulum swing, in my opinion, to start moving in the right direction.
I got into this field just completely by accident. I was doing a series of investigative food articles for Gourmet magazine, and one of them that was assigned to me was on trans fats. Well, what are trans fats? I had no idea. Researching that story really plunged me into the whole world of dietary fat, which is the subject that Americans in nutrition have obsessed about most. And that really led me down the rabbit hole. For nearly a decade, I researched everything I could find about dietary fat and cholesterol. When I started doing my research, I couldn't believe the kind of reactions that I got from interviewing scientists. I mean, I'm the daughter of a scientist, and in my father's Dreams journal, if you open up, there are math equations. I always thought that science was full of people like him, who rationally, soberly would discuss interesting ideas and consider other ideas and change their minds based on the scientific observations. And instead, in nutrition science, I couldn't believe what I found. People who were afraid to talk to me. People who said, if you're going to take that line on dietary fat, I can't even talk to you. There is some huge story here. If people are afraid to talk to me, that means there's a really big story here.
Saturated fats, butter, lard, cheese, fatty beef, and poultry with the skin on, all said to be bad for your heart. But you should replace most saturated fats with more monounsaturated healthy fats, which help reduce your risk of heart attack and stroke. Limit red meat, dark poultry meat, or poultry with the skin on to a serving the size of a deck of cards per day.
In good science, you try to do everything you can not to go public prematurely, because as soon as you go public, as soon as you claim you've discovered something you haven't, or you've realize something that you don't have the evidence to support, all these consequences kick in that make it virtually impossible to back out of. My name is Gary Taubes. I'm an investigative journalist, co-founder of a not-for-profit research organization called the Nutrition Science Initiative, author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, of Why We Get Fat, of The Case Against Sugar.
Gary Taubes is largely considered a lightning rod. Gary has never shied away from media. He will go up against anyone because what he has on his side is a little thing called facts.
I often ask myself when I was writing Good Calories, Bad Calories, it's like I have friends who are sort of have conspiratorial turns of mind where they think people do things because they're venal and they're getting paid by industry, and I just think that I don't see any conspiracy there. I don't really think the industry had much to do with it. I think the industry was given, the food industry was given this enormous gift of this bad science, and these people just, you know, literally could not have caused more harm if there had been a conspiracy. At least if there had been a conspiracy, enterprising Washington Post reporters could have interviewed the right people in garages in Washington and exposed it.
My name is Dr. Eric Westman. I'm an associate professor of medicine at Duke University Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina. The U.S. government got involved in creating guidelines for what people should eat, and it was not based on science.
What can you say about Eric Westman? You know, the original Atkins diet has been around since the early 1970s, but when they wanted to update it, they had to find a doctor to write that. Eric Westman is that guy. He wrote the new Atkins for the new you. He also started his own little obesity clinic over on the East Coast. The guy is just phenomenal.
I was involved in research communities where we would look at a guideline and see that as a straw man, as something to either prove or disprove. So unfortunately, the research that was going to support and back up the low-fat guideline never proved that it was healthy.
What's the information people are getting about their health? Because everybody wants to know, what does it mean to be healthy? And that's such a difficult question to answer. They're interested in their health, they've been searching for answers, and they found an answer that has actually done them more harm than good in the long run.
Brett Shear was this great guy I met when he came on my Fitness Confidential podcast, and just fell in love with this guy. He's a cardiologist who doesn't believe that red meat will kill you. He also feels the same way about saturated fat and cholesterol, which is a paradigm shift when you think about it, because there are not many cardiologists out there that are thinking that way.
Hormones in our body play a huge role. So things that raise our insulin are going to encourage our bodies to store more fat. So just because you're taking fat out of something and then you're enhancing it with increased carbs and sugars, that is actually making this problem worse, not helping it.
Clearly this idea that we are supposed to avoid fat has been a major factor in causing, paradoxically, the obesity epidemic. That's the big myth, the idea that it's dangerous to eat natural foods with fat and cholesterol in it.
Andreas Eenfeldt is a great guy who noticed that the more medicine he handed out, the sicker people got. And he felt that there had to be a better way. So he started working with food, you know, pulling certain things out of people's diets, adding other things. And the certain things were, you know, junk foods and sugars and grains and this sort of thing. And he started adding in red meat and fish and more fatty foods, and noticed that people were healing right up.
If you avoid fat, you end up being hungrier, and you would have to eat more of something else to feel satisfied, and that something else is carbohydrates. And our society, the way it looks, you end up eating a lot more sugar, processed carbs. That is probably the cause of the obesity epidemic today.
By this point, everyone knows there's an obesity epidemic. And while we can argue all day about fat versus low fat, pretty much everyone agrees that sugar is bad for you.
Sugar makes insulin work better and cures diabetics.
Well, almost everyone, but we'll get to that later.
BMI is one of the most commonly used measurements to determine if you're obese, but the newest research says that BMI may not be reliable.
The biggest problem with getting useful data has to do with doing the math honestly.
We actually have a problem of philosophy of science right now. We have a replication crisis where things can't be replicated. We have people who do research that do something called p-mining. The p is the statistical significance of your study.
P-hacking is manipulating data or analyses to artificially get significant p-values.
You can actually get your data and then find the statistical model that fits best to prove that your data is working. I'm Dr. Drew Pinsky. I'm an internist and addictionologist.
Dr. Drew, look, like everyone else in LA, we love Dr. Drew, all those years of Loveline, but the fact that he does what he does with addiction medicine and the lives he has saved. I'm happy to call Drew Pinsky a friend.
The way we examine populations, we're looking at sort of average effects on the mean. So people on either end may have very different physiologies that have very different sorts of interventions that we're completely missing. There's really a crisis coming in the philosophy of science.
Intelligent people should know the difference between causality and correlation. And weirdly enough, in this field of nutrition, because it's so hard to do the necessary experiments, what you end up with are correlations between health and disease, and one of the correlations is that people who consume a lot of artificial sweeteners tend to be more obese and diabetic than people who don't.
Artificial sweeteners have been a staple for dieters since the 1980s, and there's a real debate about the harm they cause.
The problem is, if you think about who uses artificial sweeteners, are the people who have weight problems, the people who can't control their weight drinking full sugared sodas. And so you have no idea of which way the causality runs, whether these people are unhealthy because they consume artificial sweeteners, or whether they consume artificial sweeteners because they're unhealthy and they're predisposed to get fat.
The major points about your diet really sort of hover around two things: fat, fruits and vegetables. You've got to really get your saturated fat and trans fat as low as you possibly can. And we know that if we do that, you can actually decrease your risk of coronary heart disease 40–50%.
There is a correlation between obesity and heart disease in that people with obesity often have other risk factors like high blood sugar, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, meaning a bad cholesterol profile. And all these things increase the risk of heart disease.
It's so easy to blame heart disease on fat. Let's take a hamburger, for instance. They'll say, well, red meat is bad for you because it's in a hamburger. They won't take into account that there was ketchup, mayonnaise, a big breaded bun, and all of the other condiments around it. And guess what? Most people never eat a hamburger without French fries. But they never blame it on the seed oils. They never blame it on the bread. They never blame it on any of the goop that's put on it. They just go to the meat and say, meat, bad. Meat causes heart disease. It makes no sense. It's black and white thinking combined with numerous studies coming out of respected names like Harvard that lead people to believe that things may not be true. What does Harvard have to do with this?
The role that Harvard plays in the nutrition story is a sad and powerful one, extremely powerful.
If you compare butter with calories from refined starch and sugar, it's going to be pretty much a wash. They'll both have adverse impacts on metabolic factors and on risk of heart disease and diabetes.
Harvard is home to two of the largest nutritional epidemiological databases in the country. What is that? That's a kind of science where they take a large group of people and they follow them for years, and they ask them what they eat, and then they see who dies or has a heart attack or gets cancer. This is a kind of science that is so fundamentally weak, right? I mean, people are asked, how many cups of spare ribs did you have in the last year? Or how many peaches or how many plums did you eat on average per week? Hundreds of questions. Well, first of all, people lie about what they eat. They want to please themselves, or they want to please the interviewers, and this has been documented in science. Secondly, that dietary data, even when they try to validate it, they find that it is highly unreliable. So you're talking about very, very weak evidence, right? And then this kind of science, epidemiology, can never prove cause and effect. It can only show an association. So it was only ever meant to generate hypotheses, which then go on to be tested. The way you test something properly to show cause and effect is to test it in a randomized controlled clinical trial. This weak science that Harvard has been publishing on dominates the whole nutrition landscape, and it is what is echoed throughout all of the media. Oh, this is only association but not causation, but then they just breeze right by that with headlines that say things like, coconut oil kills you, when that headline should read, coconut oil, we have found a small, weak association between coconut oil and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. People who eat a lot of red meat, who are those people? Those are the people who have ignored their doctor's orders for the last 35 years. That means they do a lot of other unhealthy things. They probably drink too much, they don't go to cultural events, they don't follow their doctor's orders, they don't take their medicine, they don't have happy family lives, maybe they live next to a toxic waste dump because they're poor or whatever. And then they come out with a finding that said red meat eaters, people who eat a lot of red meat are, tend to die earlier. Well, was it the meat? Was it the unhealthy lifestyle? Was it the excessive binge drinking? It could have been any one of these other things. But that is why this science is so fundamentally weak.
Your overall lifestyle, food just being one factor, is going to determine your overall health. If you eat well, change your habits, don't smoke, maybe start exercising, well, you'll be healthier. The problem is that studies get done where people get healthier by changing everything about their life, and then the results are touted as food being the reason they got healthier. This is especially rampant among vegan studies.
There have been some studies in the past, some small studies that have had some problems with them that have been propagated over and over again, showing that diet can reverse heart disease. And a big one, it was the Ornish studies in the 90s.
If you eat more calories than you burn, then you gain weight. Fat tends to cause you to be fat because fat is very dense in calories. Fat has 9 calories per gram, whereas protein and carbs have only 4, less than half. So an optimal diet is low in fat, low in the bad carbs, high in the good carbs, and enough of the good fats. And then, again, it's a spectrum. When you move in this direction, you're going to lose weight, you're going to feel better, and you're going to gain health.
What's frequently lost in that is that was a whole lifestyle program. So they got people to quit smoking, exercise more, manage their stress, and follow a vegetarian diet. But what's come out of that is that a vegetarian diet reverses heart disease, and you can't say that from that type of a study.
A vegan approach, a vegetarian approach, is consistent with standard dietary guidelines. And the question is that really a healthy approach? I'm Dr. Jeff Gerber. I'm a board-certified family doctor from Denver, Colorado. I've been a doctor for over 30 years. About 20 years ago, I realized I didn't know much about nutrition, so I took it upon myself to learn more, and I used nutrition as a tool to treat and prevent chronic disease.
I look at Jeffrey Gerber and I think hero. He looked around and went, wait a minute, I'm healing people with food. What I'm doing, what I was taught in school is not working. Instead of just going down that road the way the AHA or the ADA does, where they just keep spewing the same lies, hoping for different results, Jeffrey Gerber looked around and said, hey, we need to do something about this.
We think, especially with vegan diets, it's quite a challenge because you're often deficient of macronutrients that you would get from animal-based proteins.
Most people tell me they feel great when they go on a vegan diet, only to feel bad later. My view has always been, well, when you go on a vegan diet, you're cutting out a bunch of crap, a bunch of processed food in your life, but at some point, it's not sustainable.
I think there are lots of different approaches that can be healthy. You could even do an extreme diet like a vegan diet and feel great because you're not having sugar. You're reducing the starches that raise the blood sugar. But in my experience, some people will blindly follow certain diets, including the vegan diet, and gain 50 to 100 pounds and never even think that the vegan diet might be the cause because they know it's healthy. Because everyone else says it's healthy, it must be the plastic in my bottle that's causing the obesity. It must be the microbiome or that I'm not sleeping, when actually it was the food that they were eating.
As a cardiologist, I've come across a number of patients who are vegans, And of course, I read the literature every day that supports a vegan diet for heart health. Unfortunately, for a lot of vegans, it takes a lot of work to maintain a vegan lifestyle. You have to think about food all the time. You have to prepare your food all the time. You are hungry all the time. A number of people have decreased energy. So I think that is a downfall to the vegan way of life. Not that there can't be healthy vegans. Of course there can. But the question is, for how long?
Today we're going to explore all of the vitamins and nutrients you might need on a vegan diet. Vitamin B12, calcium, iron, choline, omega-3 fatty acids, iodine, zinc, selenium.
They don't make a very good argument, and especially like they want to come after meat as being unhealthy in multiple ways, leading to heart attack and to diabetes. And you have to understand that a lot of their comments are based on the ethical treatment of animals. And we feel the same way, that we do want to treat animals ethically, but that has nothing to do with health.
Can we prosper and thrive by feasting, in effect, on animals? And I mean, that worries me personally as well. Part of the movement is driven by the idea that eating animal products are unhealthy, which I think is just bad science. But unfortunately, the leaders, the proponents of the vegetarian-vegan movement don't like the argument we're making, because we're saying, not only are we arguing that the problem isn't red meat and animal products, but we're arguing that people can be very healthy and perhaps healthiest eating animal product-rich diets.
One of the questions today is why we're so anti-red meat. I've really wondered about that. That goes back to the 1970s, when the kind of the burgeoning of a vegetarian movement in the United States, in my hometown, Berkeley, California. That was the time, the peace movement. We had just come out of 2 world wars, and we wanted to make peace, not war. Meat has always, throughout all of history and every culture, been associated with virility. It's the food of warriors. It's the food of people who make war. It gives men and women muscle mass. It makes them strong. For instance, in the Maasai warriors, who were studied rigorously by the University of Vanderbilt scientists in the 1970s, they found that the warrior class, but not the women, the warriors consumed only meat. Meat, milk, and blood was their entire diet. So now we're being told, Americans are being told in the 1970s, not to eat meat because we want to make peace instead. This was sort of our modern idea of masculinity, and it totally makes sense for a culture that does not want to be at war.
It's so interesting if you look at the way we used to eat before the obesity and the health epidemic, and red meat was plentiful then. And then when things changed with the McGovern report, with Ansel Keys' 7-country studies, with President Eisenhower's heart attack, with that conglomeration of events, now fat being demonized and red meat being demonized, that's when everything changed. And it happened to coincide with the health epidemic that we're having now.
Red meat is back in vogue again. I mean, with the paleo diet, you have low-carb diets, you have Atkins, you even have my very own no sugars, no grains approach to eating. All allows red meat, so everything is back on the table again. But it wasn't always that way for red meat.
One of the factors that did emerge as being related to cancer risk was consumption of red meat, especially red meat, processed red meat, in relation to risk of colorectal cancer and some other cancers.
I think the bias against eating red meat has come from nutritional epidemiology. These studies look at associations between what people eat and then look at the effect on the health over a long period of time. But in the clinical research world, these are thought of as relatively weak studies. And the association level has been really low for red meat and cancer, for example.
Why can't people eat meat and vegetables? Why is this controversial? It's food. Both are real, and both can fit into your diet. This either-or argument that's going on has nothing to do with health and more to do with ideology.
They were yelling like, don't eat chickens, don't eat meat. And I was like, well, I love chicken.
There's these are two distinct phenomena, I think. One is this identification with a group and tribalism around which diet is just yet another manifestation of that. But this need to move from fad to fad to fad, that's consumerism. That is us needing a solution to how we're feeling or looking or how we think about ourselves with something now. Buy something now, do something now, and fix everything. Fix how I'm feeling now. And fad diets suit that beautifully. I think the media has a lot to do with our ill psychological well-being. To blame diet and sedentary lifestyle, I mean, I've heard blame on TV my entire life, but it's us. I mean, look, people that create media only create stuff that we watch. I mean, it's us that they're creating it for. If we didn't watch, they wouldn't create it the way they do. So we need to watch ourselves and learn how to train ourselves not to consume this garbage in such a unthoughtful way.
Bad news for bacon and sausage lovers. The World Health Organization says those foods can cause colon and stomach cancer.
Again, a lot of this information does come from media, who loves to tout institutions like Harvard whenever they put out dietary findings. Harvard said this. Harvard said that. Why shouldn't we believe Harvard?
Walter Willett of Harvard University is widely considered to be the most influential person in nutrition science today. He presides over the largest two what's called epidemiological databases in the country. And those databases, you have to understand, all they need to do is to find an association. It's just a whole bunch of statistics in there they get from dietary questionnaires, and they can just, like a mimeograph machine, they can just pull out anything. Like, meat is associated with this outcome, or vegetables are associated with this outcome, or French fried potatoes lead to more this kind of cancer. They can run those statistical tests all the time, right? There's associations. So they're publishing all the time. Well, in science, sort of the frequency of publication is part of what makes you powerful. And compare that to somebody who's doing clinical trials. Like, they might do a clinical trial and it takes them 2 years, and that's where they're actually feeding people, and they change their diets and they give them counseling. They get one paper out of that. Walter Willett really believes a vegetarian diet high in whole grains is what the diet that is the healthiest, and he wants everybody to follow that diet.
One, I think, important concept that's developed over the last decade or so is that diet quality, the combination of foods, the pattern of foods, is important in directly influencing disease risk, but also in helping us better control our body weight. So these we used to think of were sort of separate things, but now they're intertwined. And the kind of dietary pattern that Dr. Hu was talking about, like a Mediterranean diet that has lots of fruits and vegetables, low amounts of red meat, whole grains, that actually makes it easier for us to control our weight than eating a diet of refined foods that's directly unhealthy, but also makes it more difficult to control our weight.
What I found in my research is that Harvard has also received a great deal of money from one of the largest vegetable oil manufacturers in the world, called Unilever. Willett is a scientific advisor to numerous industry-backed consortiums that promote grain consumption, like Old Ways and the International Carbohydrate Quality Consortium, all funded by Barilla Pasta and Kellogg's and all these carbohydrate makers that have Willett on as their top spokesperson or top advisor, organizing conferences for them. And in 2013, I think, when Nature magazine, when they had a rare editorial kind of critique of Walter Willett, they said one of the things that he did was that he continually simplified his data and published data that really ought not to be published.
How could we find out who to trust besides your book?
Read my book. Yes. That's what it's about.
Read your book.
There's overload of information. Anybody can set themselves up as being an expert, and the public is understandably confused.
It's interesting that there's such a crusade against red meat versus other meats. And this really comes down to the fact that red meat has saturated fat, and that we've been told that saturated fat is bad. Is there a scenario where we shouldn't eat saturated fat?
There's no reason to fear saturated fat. It's just fine to eat. It's not an issue for health. If you look at the medical studies that have tested this hypothesis, if you bake them all together and look at all of the data, there's no effect on health, really.
People have been warned for years about the dangers of eating too many saturated fats and the risks they pose for heart disease. But a new analysis of more than 70 studies finds that saturated fats do not necessarily lead to greater problems with heart health.
My strength in my background is in clinical medicine, using a keto diet to help fix obesity, diabetes, and many other health problems. I've learned a lot by reading the books Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes and The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. And one of the things I learned is that the emphasis against saturated fat is also a political emphasis. So that because America doesn't make lots of saturated fat kinds of products, and because the nutritional epidemiologists are funded by other companies that make products that don't have saturated fats, there's a bias against them which is not scientific.
If saturated fat raises your cholesterol, and if cholesterol can in some situations be related to increased heart risk, then anything that is a saturated fat must be related to increased heart risk. It's this line of illogical thinking that has led institutions like the American Heart Association to demonize anything that's a saturated fat.
You know, nothing against medical doctors. It's just that when you're in a club and they keep telling you the same thing in the club, and this is the only way it is, and you never see any other viewpoint, you just start believing. Religion works like that. You will be in one religion at the expense of every other religion. And even though they all say pretty much the same thing, some people will look at their religion and go, your religion's not good because mine's the best.
I tell people who are in my clinic who are working with other doctors and cardiologists in particular to just tell them they're doing a modified Mediterranean diet. And the other doctor will go, oh, well, that's fine. And they won't ask any more because they're not really sure what the modified Mediterranean diet is, but they know it's good. So I know that it kind of plays the politics a little bit, but we're in that space where doctors sometimes knee-jerk against things that they don't know, and using familiar terms can actually make it easier for my patients to not get pushback from other doctors.
I guess the other question, though, is it something magical that's going to help everybody shed pounds and feel wonderful? And the truth may not be that far either. But it's important that we can't go out and demonize one type of food simply because we think there's a theory that it might be related to something. I mean, people listen strongly to the recommendations of these guidelines.
The vast majority of the calories are really coming from bad stuff. And so if you're looking at red meat and don't specify the comparison, you may not see much with red meat because you're comparing it with a lot of other bad stuff in the diet, a lot of refined starch, sugar, partially hydrogenated oils.
Epidemiology, you'll always find at the bottom of one of the Harvard papers, we have to, our caveat is that it's only an association, it does not prove causation, more studies are needed. But if you look at the press release that accompanies it, the headline is almost always like, coconut oil causes heart disease.
Well, there's nothing wrong with coconut oil. It's perfectly safe and actually very healthy to use in your diet and in cooking.
Good for your skin, not good in your body.
But we always hear about these controversies coming out, and it only has to do with the fact that other industries who are making hydrogenated oils don't want this pure and natural oil to be anywhere near their product.
The big problem with coconut oil is it's high in saturated fats. And as the American Heart Association tells us, saturated fat can increase your bad cholesterol, and that can lead to heart disease.
Coconut and palm oil have definitely been polarizing oils over the past few years. And it's so interesting to see why. They're vegetarian-based oils. So based on that, you would think that they should be healthy if the myth of vegetarian being the best diet is true. But because they have saturated fats, the American Heart Association came out against them, cautioning their ingestion because they have saturated fat. So it's that transitive property of math that doesn't always work.
I was invited once to speak at a palm oil conference by the manufacturers of palm oil. And they explained to me that they were having difficulty getting through a sort of taboo or cartel against palm oil because of the saturated fat in the food. And because we know saturated fat's bad and all that. And I think it was in Nina Teicholz's book where I first learned that
the whole campaign against so-called tropical oils, which is coconut oil and palm oil, in my research, I discovered that this was something of just a trade war between industries. And it's been going on actually since the 1920s and 30s. Palm oil, I think it was at the time, started being imported in increasing amounts from Malaysia, and the vegetable oil industry said, we can't have this happen. They're taking over our market share, and underwent this huge campaign basically to just slander these oils. And actually, I think that what they did is they put a tax on it at that point. They got the government to tax these oils because they didn't want the competition. Fast forward to 1980s. There's a rise in the use, again, of coconut oil and palm oil because they are solid, safe fats. So they're good for popping popcorn in movie theaters. They were used by all the packaged food companies like Kraft, Nabisco used them for their cereals and anything that needed to stay safe and solid on a shelf in a supermarket. So there started to be this increase in the importation, again, of coconut oil and palm oil. Well, that really threatened the makers of soybean oil and the soybean industry, because soybean is far and away the biggest oil that Americans consume. So they started a campaign against coconut oil and palm oil. They call them the tropical oils. And this was a campaign, really a trade war campaign, sort of in the shroud of a health concern issue.
So if they're gonna say something like that, they should have very strong evidence behind it to back it up. And there is no evidence to demonize these oils the way they have. They can be a very good part of a healthy diet, and there's no reason at all to be worried about them as it's been proposed.
There's a lot of bad science that I think implicates saturated fat and leads to this idea that we should replace it with vegetable oils.
Oh, those must be good for us because they're vegetables. In fact, they're not from vegetables. They're from seeds and beans. So, sunflower, safflower, corn, soybean, they're all beans and seeds, and you have to use high heat and a heavy metal chelate in order to get the oils out of them. Winterized, deodorized, and stabilized. I mean, they initially come out of this like gray, disgusting liquid, and then they have to be turned into something that might seem like it could be consumed for humans. And they've also gone through name changes. Now they're trying to call them plant oils, I think, to seem even more appealing.
If you compare saturated fat with healthy plant oils, using those healthy plant oils will definitely reduce the risk of heart disease while they're improving blood lipids at the same time.
Healthy people tend to eat vegetable oils. It's the gist of the problem. When you do these studies, what you do is you tell people how to eat. So in the 1970s, you tell them they should avoid saturated fat and eat vegetable oils, and then you follow them for 30 years, and lo and behold, you found out that 30 years later, the healthier people have indeed been doing exactly what you told them to do because they're health conscious.
By the end of the 1980s, between that campaign and various other efforts to get rid of tropical oils, most of the tropical oils had been taken out of the food supply.
And so they're avoiding saturated fats and using vegetable oils to cook with instead. And they're healthier, but that doesn't mean they got healthier because they use the vegetable oils.
I do wonder if the recent outcry against tropical oils that you've seen by the American Heart Association and by Harvard, I really wonder to what extent we're seeing just a redux of this same trade war. I know that Harvard is funded by vegetable oil companies that compete with tropical oils. So one really has to wonder if they're now sort of trotting out scientists to protect the domestic American soybean and soybean oil industries.
So there are two changes that I think are necessary. First, we need to get away from this idea that saturated fat is bad for us. It's really not a major factor. We need to accept that saturated fat can be a part of a healthy diet. Second thing we need to get away from is this idea that it's all about calories, that just by counting calories, eating less, and running more, you would magically sort of lose weight. It's really not effective for the vast majority of people, and we need to focus more on the hormonal regulation of weight, live in a way that makes our body normalize the hormones, including the fat-storing hormone insulin, so that it becomes much easier to maintain a good weight.
The fact of the matter is, exercise is very important. I always call it the fountain of youth. The problem is that it's not good for weight loss.
We've been teaching people you have to exercise, and I've had people who can't exercise because of a bum knee or just they don't like it, and they don't even try to lose weight or fix their diabetes because they've been told they have to exercise. In fact, this is perpetuated by a lot of doctors as well, and because it's worked for them, they think it'll work for other people.
Now, I'm a big proponent of exercise, and I think exercise is crucial for a healthy overall lifestyle, but it's not the go-to way to lose weight. It was in the best interest of these snack companies and the companies making the high carbohydrate, low fat foods. It was in their best interest to say, as long as you're exercising and as long as you're burning calories, then you can eat whatever you want and however much you want. that's what padded their bottom line, and that's what sold more products. And that's what helped perpetuate this myth that exercise was the best thing you could do for your health, and you could exercise away any amount of poor dietary indiscretion.
In theory, the idea makes a lot of sense. You burn calories through exercise, which must lead to fat loss. The laws of thermodynamics is a good idea. It just doesn't work here. You cannot outrun a bad diet.
So modern nutrition science begins in the late 1860s with the invention by German researchers of devices called calorimeters that allow you to measure the energy expended by a large animal like a dog or a human. So you live inside these rooms and you can get a measurement of how much energy is expended. And so by the 1860s, the nutrition community for the first time ever can measure the energy that people consume in foods. You burn the foods in what's called a bomb calorimeter, and you measure the heat released, and that tells you how much energy was in the foods. And now you can measure the energy out. And for the next 50 to 60 years, all of nutrition science was basically measuring energy in and energy out, and vitamin and mineral deficiency diseases and protein requirements, and a little bit about things like fiber. And so by the early 1900s, when researchers, clinical investigators, physicians interested in these problems are trying to come up with a hypothesis of obesity and related to the food we consume, all they have are energy in, energy out, vitamins, minerals, protein, fiber. And they can't figure out a way that vitamins and minerals and protein and fiber can play a meaningful role in obesity, so they end up with energy in and energy out. That's it. That's because that's what they can measure. And that becomes a theory ever since, and it gets locked in, and it stays locked in. That's the weird thing. In 1921-22, the hormone insulin is discovered, and the science of endocrinology, of hormones and hormone-related diseases starts to explode. But you still can't measure the impact of food on the hormone levels in the blood until the 1960s. So it's only in the 1960s that you have another way that you can study that food influences what our body is doing. And by that time, we've had 50 years of thinking of obesity as an energy balance disorder. We realize that if you change the hormonal status, elevate insulin levels, depress glucagon levels, growth hormone is playing a role, and our foods are influencing all of that. Nobody cares. It's just too complicated. This energy balance idea is too big to fail. And then diet book doctors get involved. Like first Herman Thaler writes a book called Calories Don't Count. And then the infamous Robert Atkins, and they read the research and they say, wait a minute. It's not about how much you eat. It's a hormonal thing, and it's the carbs are the problem, and get rid of the carbs. And now the research community doesn't like this idea because it's coming from these cowboy diet book doctors, and they don't want to listen to them. Some very petty human emotions feed into this idea that we should continue to tell people to do the wrong thing. And they should do the wrong thing, and if it fails, we can blame them. We don't have to never think that our advice is wrong, because we've got the laws of thermodynamics propping them up.
We always get into this argument over what's the best fuel to put in your body. One thing everyone agrees on is that sugar is bad for you. And when I say everyone, I mean almost everyone. Some doctors, including one who proposes a vegan diet, says sugar is not the major cause of diabetes. You really have to see this to believe it.
Carbohydrate, including pure white sugar, increases the sensitivity to insulin. It was published by Brunzell from University of Washington in the New England Journal of Medicine in, I think, 78. Brunzell's his name. He took type 2 diabetics. He made a synthetic diet, 45% sugar, and then doubled white sugar, maltodextrose, plain table sugar, doubled it to 85% white sugar. Every aspect of the diabetes improved. Walter Kempner, back in the 40s and 50s, published his results on treating type 2 diabetics with rice, table sugar, fruit, and juice. And Kempner knew back in the 50s that sugar makes insulin work better and cures diabetics. But you see, we've got it entirely backwards these days, thinking sugar causes diabetes. It's so backward and bizarre, nobody stands a chance.
I didn't think we would have to clarify what sugar does to your body, but here are just a few reasons why it's bad for you.
Some people easily understand that sugar is bad, and they can avoid foods that have sugar, the sugar-free things, and the problem is it doesn't explain all of the carbohydrate effect on the blood sugar. So starches, including the breads, pasta, rice, fruit, those things raise the blood sugar just like real sugar or actual sugar, and even honey, natural sugar, raises the blood sugar.
One of my favorite things when you walk into Eric Westman's office, and I've never walked in, but people who have, apparently there's a sign on the wall that says that fruit is nature's candy.
The reason that sign is up there is that most people don't realize that having fruit can raise the blood sugar, can make diabetes worse, can lead to obesity.
It raises your blood sugar, increases the fat-storing hormone insulin, and puts the body into fat-storing mode. Fat in the liver, if you eat a lot of sugar, you would end up with a fatty liver, and that increases fasting insulin levels, so you get insulin resistance and high insulin levels all through the day.
Sugar is addictive, and it may not be addictive for everyone, just like alcohol isn't addictive for everyone, but it's addictive for a large number of people. I mean, I've been spending the past at least 17 years as a psychiatrist talking to people, thousands and thousands of people, hearing their stories. And when I talk to people about food, there are many clues to addiction in their stories. My name is Georgia Eade. I'm a psychiatrist.
Georgia Eade, the only words I could come up with for her is pioneer. She's a psychiatrist. She's a medical doctor. And as a psychiatrist, the first thing that happens if you go to one of these people with a problem is they're looking to put you on a medication. Georgia, not the same thing. Georgia is there trying to figure out if she can heal you, number one, without medication. Number two, which is as important as number one, let's try to do it with food.
Being preoccupied with food, feeling guilty after eating food that they think is, quote, bad for them, and, you know, spending a lot of time thinking about food that would be better spent doing other things. And, you know, I think that it's one of the things that people really want a lot of help with. But when I'm talking to people about food, I hear the same patterns as if I'm talking to somebody with any other substance abuse disorder.
For the average person, that reward is enough to keep you going. And I can tell you personally, when I get off carbohydrates, and I've known this for years, you have a withdrawal. I get all the same symptoms, milder, mind you, again, so I don't like too powerful a connection with addiction per se. It minimizes the misery of my patients. But when I come off carbohydrates, get irritable, discontent, I have pain, I have sleeplessness, I have anxiety. Opiate withdrawal. I have full-on opiate withdrawal for 3 days every time.
And that's what we're trying to protect against on a keto diet, to try to stop that raise of blood sugar, to prevent diabetes or treat it, and to prevent the insulin rise, which is the hormonal state of creating obesity.
We'll go into depth about the ketogenic diet momentarily, but we first have to understand that most of our problem stems from what industry is doing. And as I said in Fat Part 1, industry is a machine. It's not a person. It's a thing that's designed to make money, and that's it. It's not good or bad. It just is.
It's tough if you're the sugar industry, but the beverage industry was always happy to sell artificially sweetened beverages because artificial sweeteners were cheaper than sugar, if nothing else. They didn't care what people drank as long as they drank their products. Grain industry, they could create grain that's got a lower glycemic index. You know, the lesson of the 1980s was when we told people to create low-fat foods, they were happy to do it. And they changed the way we eat. The problem is they changed the way we eat for the worse.
I think the tide is starting to shift somewhat. People now realize that added sugars are not good. I mean, there was a point, it sounds ridiculous to say, but there was a point where people didn't quite realize added sugars were unhealthy for you.
Eating sugar is not essential whatsoever. And in fact, our body will make sugar at a certain point from eating protein.
The Institute of Medicine itself acknowledges that there is no essential need for any carbohydrate. The body needs a certain amount of glucose for the functioning of its brain and its eyes, but your body is able to make that glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis from the protein that you consume.
Gluconeogenesis is the process by which your body will take excess protein and convert it into glucose.
Many people wonder if there is a need for carbohydrate in the diet at all. In other words, is there an essential carbohydrate, meaning the body can't make it, so you have to eat it? And that is in debate. It's not clear. One of the most unbiased sources of nutritional information, the Institute of Medicine, actually says pretty clearly there is no essential carbohydrate. You don't have to eat carbohydrate. Based on that, I wrote a letter to the editor some years ago just questioning whether carbohydrate was essential. It's interesting that that letter has been cited many, many times. It was just a letter to the editor. The science in regard to how you create an essential nutrient and what you call a macronutrient. So when you're on a keto diet, your macronutrients are proteins and fats.
The idea that sugar had any benefit actually stems from fallacies propagated in the 1970s. Ads in magazines saying things like, sugar can be the willpower you need to undereat. There's a famous headline for an FDA study that hilariously reads, government gives sugar a clean bill of health.
That clean bill of health was that the amount of sugar that the FDA was estimating we were consuming at the time, which was, they said, was 40 pounds per capita per year, which was probably 40 to 60 pounds less than we were consuming. And then they said we don't know what would happen if we were to actually consume more than 40 pounds per capita. And virtually the year that they made that claim, sugar consumption then starts to skyrocket. The reliable data you have is on what's called food availability, how much sugar is being made available to the American public by the industry and by imports. And that number around 1800 was 4 pounds. By 1984, when the FDA said it was 40, the food availability numbers were already about 120 pounds per capita, and they estimated that we were consuming about a third of that. They're taking what they know, which is how much is made available. It's a reliable number and you could use to compute trends from, and then they're creating this estimate of how much we actually consume and then say, well, 40 pounds doesn't sound like a lot, but it's kind of a meaningless number because you have nothing to compare it to. It's certainly 10 to 20 times larger than what we were consuming 150 years earlier. They started doing this in the 1940s during World War II because we had to know how much food was available and what we could expect to deal with food rationing during the war, and they kept it up religiously since the 1940s, and they backdated it to 1907 to get a feel for what had happened in the previous war and World War I, and to get this history. And so if you accept the backdated data from 1907, it looks as though we used to be eating a lot less meat then. And then we added meat to our diets, we added animal products, and it went along with this epidemic of heart disease that appeared to emerge after the 1920s. And the arguments I make in my book is both the USDA data is faulty and perhaps what you have is a correlation, again, between two things, change in diet over time and change in health status, and it doesn't tell you that there's any causality between the two. It just tells you they're correlated. Now you can generate a hypothesis and say we think meat consumption causes heart disease, and then you could do an experiment which is called a randomized controlled trial to test that hypothesis, and that experiment has never been done.
As we discussed in the last film, money has a lot to do with this. When you don't spend the money on the studies, it's easy to say, there's no study that says keto works.
These studies are extremely expensive, and there have been enough good studies done to support our moderate approach, which is looking at balanced foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, and lean meat and dairy products.
How do you know it doesn't work if there's never been any large-scale studies? Back before I wrote my book, Fitness Confidential, I only had my clients in LA who I worked with. After the book came out and then the podcast got popular, now it wasn't just 20 or 30 students. It was first hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands. So once you have that many people doing N1 and it's working, well, it's not an N1 experiment anymore.
It's actually been known for a long time that the root cause is eating too much and specifically carbohydrates. So 150 years ago, the first treatment for obesity was actually a low-carb ketogenic diet. It was written about in England, and I find myself in a curious situation where I'm just reminding people of something that we've known for 150 years, that one, solution for the obesity and diabetes epidemic is a low-carb ketogenic diet.
If you go back to the 1970s, Dr. Atkins was considered a kook. I remember the big joke back then was, do Atkins, you'll lose weight, and then you'll be a really good-looking corpse because you're going to die from this diet.
Telling people that, beef is good and so on is or that butter is good, or, telling people what they want to hear is a good way to sell books. It's a good way to, magazines are hurting for business now on the internet. Everyone's looking for something controversial that they can tell people what they want to hear, and I understand that, but it does people a tremendous disservice.
The low carbohydrate keto community is based on science, and I understand that there are lots of ways to be healthy. You don't have to do a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet if you don't have carbohydrate tolerance, or if you don't have insulin resistance. You can eat lots of different things.
And it's this insulin resistance that can drive so many downstream markers of inflammation and glycation and other detrimental processes in our body that can then lead to heart disease. So whether obesity itself causes heart disease or whether it's this constellation of health problems that occur in people who are obese, that seems more likely.
People will say to me emphatically, well, keto is bad. And I'll ask them why, and there's no answer. They'll just go, it's bad. My doctor said it was bad.
And it throws your body into a state of emergency. That's what ketosis is.
As we said in the first movie, ketosis and ketoacidosis are two completely different things.
Nutritional ketosis is quite a different scenario. Blood sugars are absolutely under control. The patient is healthy in every single way. Electrolytes, insulin, glucose, perfectly controlled. We have now trained the body to switch over from burning carbohydrate as the primary fuel. Now the individual becomes fat adapted, and that's really the difference between a very unhealthy and a very healthy state.
If we're going to even pretend we're on the same page, we need to know that basic fact. A lot of the times when even medical professionals, especially TV nutritionists, describe in essence what ketosis is, they always point out completely harmless and sometimes unproven things to get you to not do it.
There are some really interesting side effects that come with it.
Your autophagy process is totally out of whack.
Disaster pants.
0 calorie restriction on a ketogenic diet.
Keto crotch.
If you have a sandwich or something right now, you might just want to go ahead and put that down.
Animal fats and animal proteins.
Unless you have epilepsy, I'm not seeing a whole lot of upside to this.
They're desperate.
Right.
They're just desperate.
Bacterial vaginosis.
Rich in saturated fat.
So I actually have not done keto myself, as you might guess, but...
The keto diet is the sort of latest thing, which is already promoting pushback from the community. Like they're trying to tell people don't even try it because it's going to give you bad breath or constipation, and therefore, if you weigh 300 pounds, you should just continue weighing 300 pounds because if you lost 100 but your breath smelled like ketones, that would be a tragedy.
Get all the benefit over here, none of the negatives over here, and all the benefits over there.
For a ketogenic diet is a particularly, I want to use the word magical diet for many neurological conditions, many brain and body nervous system conditions. When you eat a ketogenic diet, you're using fat primarily for energy, and the brain is using, to a large extent, ketones instead of glucose. It can't use 100% ketones, but it can use about 2/3 of its energy can come from ketones if you're eating a fat-based diet as opposed to a carbohydrate-based diet. So we're not entirely sure why this diet is so healthy for the brain and has been able to, help people with early Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and seizure disorders, and but it stands to reason that if these diets, which have been used to treat epilepsy now for almost 100 years, perhaps longer, if these diets can be helpful in calming brain chemistry in that way, perhaps they could be helpful for other brain disorders as well, including psychiatric disorders, which have a lot in common with neurological disorders. Really, psychiatric disorders are neurological disorders. It's simply that they manifest as changes in behavior and emotion as opposed to changes in the sensory motor system with the muscular system, for example. So the ketogenic diet, the way we think it works is that ketones burn burn cleanly and more efficiently and than glucose does in the brain. And so you create less oxidation, less inflammation. So I tell my patients to think of refined carbohydrates in particular, sugar, flour, fruit juice, cereals, as mood destabilizers. I think that there's a lot of potential benefit here. The science is very, very new when it comes to psychiatric disorders and ketogenic diets, but it's emerging and it's all pointing in the same direction. It's very, very promising. If we get this message out, I think that there are many doctors out there who really want to understand this and would be open-minded and would be curious to incorporate some of these principles into their practice, because we have so many patients who do not respond to medication, or who get side effects from medication, or who don't want to take medication, or can't afford medication. And so isn't it wonderful if we have something else to offer those people?
When I got into this field in the early 2000s, the sort of medical orthodoxy, the dominant hypothesis in the nutrition establishment was that fat, saturated fat, cholesterol are terrible for health. And if you believed otherwise, or if you wrote otherwise, you would really suffer as a scientist if you said anything against that orthodoxy in the field. So here I come along saying, oh, but this paper, the conclusions don't reflect the data. Can you explain that to me? Or this doesn't seem to add up. And people were terrified to go on the record saying anything against this dominant hypothesis. Because the cost to them, there are real costs to a scientist in challenging that orthodoxy. People who couldn't get their papers published because they had said something that was challenging to this orthodoxy. They were disinvited from expert conferences. They could not get research grants, or their research grants were canceled. Scientists learn to self-censor because what they want to do is they want to do science. That's their job. And if they can't get money and if they can't publish their papers because they're talking out in ways that their seniors disapprove of, then they can't do their science. So they really did not want to talk about this issue that was so deeply risky to them. But I've been told that in order to get NIH funding, they actually look at how many times your name appears in the news media. So there's this incentive to make your studies into this kind of clickbait, which is completely irresponsible. Consumers don't know. They're completely confused. One of the clever kind of rhetorical things that Harvard and others, somebody like David Katz at Yale do, is they always say, like, you poor consumers, you're so confused, and you're all these internet crazies out there, and book authors are making you confused.
We are here assembled in Stockholm, and all seem to agree that we need a more plant-based diet and are talking about how to achieve it, and yet the public is fascinated by the currently prevailing meme that we should all eat more meat, butter, and cheese. We have lost the faith of the public. We are like firefighters who bicker among ourselves about who has the right caliber hose. The mission is to get there from here, and there is a beautiful place, the place we want to bequeath to our children.
What is making people confused is the publication of this weak epidemiological data, which almost 100% of the time turns out to be wrong. I mean, what is the list of things that epidemiology has been wrong on? Vitamin E supplements, vitamin A supplements, vitamin C supplements, hormone replacement therapy turned out to be killing women, dietary cholesterol caps, why we all ate egg white omelets and avoided shellfish for all that time. That turned out to be wrong and was retracted. The low-fat diet. The government and the American Heart Association have backed off the low-fat diet. Why were we eating a low-fat diet? Because of epidemiology. So the people confusing us are the epidemiologists, the experts themselves.
Most of the current social media argument is over extremes. Go all vegan or go all meat. No one knows who to trust, and then both messages get commercialized and bastardized.
Now you're in fad diet land. Now it's de facto quackery, because if it wasn't quackery, why would you need this cardiologist in New York or this gynecologist in Brooklyn writing about it instead of it coming out of Harvard or Cornell or Yale? They've been fighting this thing for 50 years, and the longer you fight it, again, now we're into the cognitive dissonance, the more you have to be right.
I have a lot of patients who are confused or at least tell me about the vegan diet and how, especially among young women, my daughter included, one of them, it's very fashionable to be a vegan and you feel like you're doing the right thing for animals and all. But as a scientist, I want to promote or recommend a diet that's actually healthy for humans, not just for animals, right? So I mean, I'm here to help the person in front of me in a clinic, so I want the diet to be as healthy as possible. And it's possible with a vegan diet to have nutritional deficiencies.
Some of the nutrients of concern in the vegan diet include vitamin B12, iron, calcium, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids including EPA and DHA, and protein. We found that some of these nutrients, which can have implications in neurologic disorders, anemias, bone health, and other health concerns, can be deficient in vegan diets.
Low-carb diets for a vegetarian is possibly a successful approach. We actually have low-carb vegetarians who perhaps can add dairy or eggs or fish and chicken to the diet, and in this way they can lead a healthy life. But I think it is fair to say that we are omnivores, and animal-based proteins as well as plant-based proteins can be healthy for us.
You know, you can say what the science says, and then you can say what people actually do and actually stick with. And you want a diet, a nutritional program that's going to make you feel good, give you energy, make it so you're not hungry all the time, so you don't have to think about food all the time.
We get a lot of pushback from the vegetarian community where I think I wish they would see they were all arguing we all want people to be as healthy as humanly possible, and we want ethical decisions to be made on the correct implications. So if I'm going to risk my health for the health of other species, I want to know that's what I'm doing. I don't want to be have the misconception that I'm going to be healthier because that's what I'm, by also that the ethical decision is also the one that's supported by, medical science.
All we do is talk and talk and talk about health, and at the same time, we're just getting fatter and more unhealthy. If America is so worried about its health, how do we get so fat?
Because we have such big problems with obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, all kinds of diseases, it's not surprising that people are more interested in their health than ever, because they have to be. You don't have to be interested in your health if everything's all right? It's only when you have a problem that you need to do something about it.
The myth is that the healthcare system is the best place to go to get healthy. That's another terrible myth that so many people are falling into that trap. And if you're acutely ill, if you need a surgery, if you have a bad infection, the healthcare system is fantastic. But when it comes to these chronic diseases we're facing, unfortunately, it is a myth that the healthcare system is the best place to address those.
There's a lot of information today on the internet. It's a wonderful thing and it's a terrible thing. There are people who have their own agendas to promote saying the darndest things, and my patients watch those and read them, and I have to try to correct them.
Based on the research, we cannot say with any certainty that eating red or processed meat causes cancer, diabetes, or heart disease.
The study recommends adults continue current red and processed meat consumption. It's a finding that's prompted calls for a retraction. The most prominent critic, Harvard School of Public Health, which labeled that conclusion irresponsible and unethical.
It's crazy because the more that we learn that meat is healthy and people are getting healthy with these hundreds of thousands of N1 experiments, the more the chasm grows between the meat eaters and the vegans. I was watching one vegan propaganda film about a year ago, and they were claiming that eating one egg is equivalent to smoking 5 cigarettes a day. One egg.
I never really thought about eggs much. I just thought of them as a standard part of a healthy diet. But then I found a study suggesting that eating just one egg a day can be as bad as smoking 5 cigarettes per day for life expectancy.
In that case, I'm smoking a pack every morning. It makes absolutely no sense. The problem is people are going to watch these movies and believe this.
Researchers found a stepwise increase in risk the more and more eggs people ate. Eating just a single egg a week appeared to increase the odds of diabetes by 76%.
The reality is that a food that has just fat, or an egg, for example, doesn't raise the blood sugar at all. It has a glycemic index of 0. And so if a scientist is claiming that the egg has a glycemic effect, it's just not true. Eggs don't cause diabetes. Now, unless you're eating carbohydrates, then you put it all into the one mix together. But the interesting thing, when you look at the glycemic index of different foods, is that the foods that have no carbohydrates are not on that list. So oils, butter, eggs have a glycemic index of 0. There is a fear, unfounded fear, of the cholesterol going up, eating more fat, more eggs, and we now know that it is an increase in good cholesterol as well, and a reduction of the bad cholesterol called triglyceride, or bad fats in the blood, for example. So the extreme case of some people being told not to do this, even though there are clear benefits based on a worry about a long-term effect of cholesterol, is just sadly wrong, and through the lens of today's understanding of the science.
So you look at who gets heart disease, and you look at how many eggs they're eating, and lo and behold, people who eat eggs get more heart disease than people who don't. They're probably not as health conscious as people who don't eat eggs, because for 50 years we've been told don't eat eggs. So very health conscious people. In the 90s, I probably boiled 10,000 eggs in the 90s, and I probably threw out 10,000 yolks. Okay, because the yolks have fat and cholesterol in it. We were taught they would kill people. So you do these studies, and lo and behold, you find out that people who eat eggs have a higher rate of heart disease. That's a correlation, and then you pretend correlation is causation, because that's why you did the study to begin with. And then you make this claim, and then you have this whole world. And the people who want to believe that's true embrace the claim and act like it's true because they had a single published study that said it's true. I don't think these people really care that much about whether it makes us healthier. Maybe they do. I think they care about the animals, and that's a wonderful cause, but that's not what I'm trying to do at the moment.
The group says that activism isn't violence and that they have a love-based approach.
Not everyone's like you and don't care about animals.
Oh, I do care about animals.
You care about animals,
yeah, absolutely.
But you condemn them to a slaughterhouse when you eat them.
If somebody gives up meat and goes vegetarian or vegan and gets healthy, and they can control their weight and they control their blood sugar, and then, geez, that's the greatest thing in the world, and I'm happy for them. But if they can do it by eating a low-carb, high-fat diet, which clearly people can, then I think we should be happy for them and support it.
A high-fat diet is not unhealthy on its own and should not be avoided even if you're a green-only vegan, unless, in fact, you don't like the food. The myth still persists that fat is going to kill you, or at the very least, make you fat.
It's what I call the tragic homonym. The fat in bacon is not the same as the fat on your hips. It's different. And another idea that is just deeply ingrained in us is this idea that, all green things are good, all vegetables are good.
And vegetables are good, but again, it's not either or. What does a doctor say about adding fat?
Well, it sure seems logical that the fat in the food would become the fat on your body, on your bottom, for example. But it turns out that it's the insulin hormone inside that creates the situation for you to be able to deposit the fat. And insulin is actually generated by eating carbohydrates. So it's actually the dietary carbohydrates, the sugars and the starches, that are fattening. But the confusion comes into play because if you're eating carbohydrates and fats, then you will get fat. But it's not the fat that caused it. It was the carbohydrates that led to the insulin that caused the fat to be fattening. So another part of the confusion is that low-fat diets work. The problem is that they cause excessive hunger for most people, and so they don't practically work for many people. And we've seen that to be true because the U.S. has been advocating low-fat diets for the last 30 years, and it hasn't worked practically for most Americans. It's not that it can't work, it's just that it hasn't been a practical solution.
I've always thought that our government should operate according to the principle, like medical doctors, when they swear an oath to their profession that they should at least do no harm. When they started off the dietary guidelines, they didn't even know what to tell Americans what to eat. They just simply said, have 7 to 11 servings of bread every day. That was what they told people. Then they actually went and told the food industry, you must go out and create thousands of more low-fat and therefore high-carb food products for us. The defenders of the nutrition establishment say, oh, we could not have anticipated that people would eat more sugars. It's not our fault that they all went out and scarfed down Snackwell cookies. Well, the government told the industry to make those foods.
New Snackwell's reduced fat candy.
Yes, like luscious, chocolatey caramel nut clusters.
And the American Heart Association was also putting its, heart healthy check mark on, Frosted Flakes and Cocoa Puffs and all these foods that were super high in sugar. But because they didn't have a lot of fat, they were considered healthy. The only measure of health was that it didn't have fat in it.
What a creamy way to cut the fat.
Is the pendulum swinging? That is a big question. I think clearly it is, in that there is a bottom-up revolution going on.
The people who end up in an obesity medicine clinic like mine happen to be the ones who have the bad metabolism, where a very small amount of sugar or starch or grains can be detrimental. And so that's why we're very strict about teaching people how to stay away from those foods, teaching people to have great foods, things that they thought they couldn't have, like bacon and pate and brie, and depending where you live, there's just a wide array of foods that don't have carbohydrates that are very tasty and healthy.
It takes motivation to do a diet, and I've not really been very motivated to make a dietary change in the last few years. I don't know why. I don't know, my head wasn't in that space, but this is one of the important psychologies about dieting. You have to decide to make a change. And I was doing a podcast about health and fitness, so I thought, all right, you walk it like you talk it, so I better do it. But I remember it was a moment. It's like any major change. There's a moment where you go, okay, I'm gonna do this.
A lifestyle that you can stick with that is going to help you control your hormones, your insulin hormones, your fat storage hormones. That's going to be the best way to lose weight in the long run, because we don't care if you're going to lose weight in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. That's not where health is. Where health is permanently reversing any metabolic damage, making you healthy on the inside, and then weight loss will follow.
You have to be ready to do it, just like stopping smoking, anything else. You have to be ready to do it, and you have to do it. The great thing about this diet is it's painless. The diet itself is painless. And once you make the change, you feel so good, it's self-sustaining. You want to stay with it. You want to optimize it. And you certainly don't want to lose what you got.
There's a Credit Suisse report that came out a little while ago saying the market is going to shift on fats. So, telling business, get ready for this. It's going to change. We see butter sales going through the roof. We see meat consumption actually increasing. There are signs in the market that that consumer-driven demand is changing.
So there seems to be somewhat of a groundswell. You walk into grocery stores and things are now paleo, the way things used to be vegan. You walk into bookstores and there's books on low carb, and the computer is just full of all of this stuff. Look, I get it. We live in a society where everyone wants everything fast. Just tell me what to do. You want no sugars, no grains? Eat bacon. Eat beef. Eat an avocado. That's NSNG. NSNG, you have gray areas. I know you were on the whole 30, right? It's like either you're in or you're out.
Yeah.
NSNG, you can mess up at noontime and you're right back in that evening, and you just go with it. As long as you're cutting out sugars and grains, you're on point. I've done well over 1,700 podcasts at this point, and I use one line in each and every podcast: your good intentions have been stolen. I'm just here to try to help you get them back.